Try to make me smile, to melt away my fear. You're cracking through the eyes of so many years. Your touch is light and true. Keep doing what you do. I'm healing from a frigid past and welcoming your rescue. If you're sure to take it slow, then maybe I can learn to let love grow like sunshine rising in the sky. You bring warmth of summertime. Your words are like a breeze, a soothing song that washes over me. I begin to believe as I hear you whispering that love is an amazing thing.
Hey everybody, this is Richard Sachs, your host on Lost Arts Radio. I'm here with Doug Diamond, and we're broadcasting worldwide with special guest Dr. Gabriel Cousens, who's back for his monthly installment of our health and live food living lessons that he's been graciously doing with us since, I think it was last November that we started, something like that. And so we're up to about lesson 8 or so, and he had said that he'd like to do 12, which will take us through this November, and then we'll put them together and get them into a form that's convenient for everybody to access. So if you remember, we've been talking about, toxic synergy, different aspects of that for quite a while, which is how different toxic elements in the environment and ones that are intentionally put into our bodies actually act together to have more than an additive effect. In other words, if there's one that has a toxic element of 3, say, excuse me, and another one that is 5, and you put them both in your body, they don't turn out to be an 8. Maybe they turn out to be a 50, and we that's what he called toxic synergy, working together to become even more harmful to the body. So it becomes even more important to know what's going into your body. And some of these things, like vaccines and many of the drugs and other things, have multiple ingredients in one apparent toxin. So if a particular vaccine is considered as one toxin, well, maybe it's got 50 harmful ingredients, which explains a lot of the extent of the damage from these things. So we talked about that quite a while, and he gradually got into a discussion of psychotropic drugs. In other words, drugs that create changes in the brain. We talked about that quite a bit, and this time we're going to be getting more into the connection between behaviors which are connected to what's going on in the brain and which toxins are going in. And he has a particular interest and focus on violence in this installment, which I find really interesting because violence is revving up all over the world right now, orchestrated by the global rulers and leaders who are all incredibly coordinated in this attempt to make things as chaotic as they possibly can make them, so that, it's not complex. If society breaks down, then the idea is that all of us peasants start begging for the United Nations and the world rulers and the militaries of the combined forces of the world to come in and save us from the chaos that the rulers themselves created. It's what David Icke and others have called problem reaction solution, that that Alex and others have talked a lot about. They create the problem with a predictable reaction on our part, and then they offer the solution to the problem that they created, and the solution makes a worse situation than before the original problem. So it's worked well for thousands of years, and they're still doing it now. And the aspect that Dr. Cousens is wanting to add is, well, just like we've seen, I guess it was Dr. Rima Lebo and others on our program have brought up the idea that, pointed out the fact that in most of these school shootings in the U.S. that they're trying to use to prove that we should outlaw guns except for the criminals in the government, that they come from people who are on psychotropic drugs virtually every time. And of course, this is never looked at. It's not allowed to be in the news. The media can't cover it because they're largely funded by the drug companies, all of which are in on the same strategy to show that we have to be further controlled. And all these shooters, have been on drugs and right on many of the drugs, which, some of which, like Prozac, have fluoride, interestingly enough, is one of the main ingredients. I think Prozac is something like half fluoride. It's got a large amount in it. And this subject is just completely forbidden. You cannot talk about it, especially in the major media. And I guess we have a temporary luxury here that since we're not very big yet in our listenership, that we get to talk about these forbidden things without too much harassment. But overall, in general, you're not supposed to be aware of these things at all. And so it's very relevant to the fact that Dr. Cousens wanted to bring up in a lot more detail what's going on as a connection between the drugs and the toxins that we take in, the changes that they make in the brain, and the behaviors that come as a result of those changes. In other words, you can change the physical brain, if you know what you're doing, chemically or in other ways, so that the person will start demonstrating certain kinds of insanity. And it's completely biological. And it's one of the great, most powerful effects of the whole drug industry, which is, a main part of the medical industry, that it takes away the normal functioning of the brain. And you would think that somebody would have noticed that this is not a very good idea, but we'll talk more a little bit later on of how and why that started, even though it was always a terrible idea right from the beginning. But, fortunately, as I'm sure Dr. Cousens will point out, because it's what he's been doing for decades, there are solutions once you realize that this is going on. So there is actually a reason to know about these things. The most famous one that probably Dr. Cousens is known for in his incredible work is he chose one disease which he considers to be a big part of his mission in the world, and that disease is diabetes. And he wrote a book called There is a Cure for Diabetes. And, the reason he titled it that, among other things, is that there officially is not a cure for diabetes. You're supposed to take insulin injected into your body, which is, kind of a copy of what your own system is supposed to produce in precise amounts at precise times, and just very crudely injected into the body. And this, predictably, has all kinds of terrible side effects, which actually are the main effects. They're just called side effects so that maybe you won't notice that it's the main thing the drug does. And the long-term effects of diabetes treated this way are pretty catastrophic. And they're widespread, rampant right now, especially in the so-called advanced countries, but also in a lot of other places where there's a lot of, especially a lot of refined food and sugar consumption. And so Dr. Cousens has demonstrated that you can deal with that from a live food approach, changing the lifestyle, getting away from cooking the food, which kills the life force in it. And nobody really seemed to notice that when they were, during all these thousands of years of extensive development of cooked food and whole cultures being created around it. And just by stopping the cooking, which nobody thinks of as bad, but unfortunately, the body biologically doesn't respond well to cooked food. I mean, certainly better to, if you're going to cook food, at least cook whole foods like, a cabbage or broccoli or something that grows, rather than a package of things you can't even pronounce. Matt Monarch has talked a lot about that and said that, most people psychologically aren't ready to just go on to completely raw food. So a fantastically good step in that direction is stop eating the completely dead fake foods, which are the processed food. And Dr. Cousens teaches how to transition away from those things, getting rid of a lot of the toxins that they include. And he does this all over the world, but in the U.S., he has a place called Tree of Life. And you can look that up, just put it into a search engine like Startpage or DuckDuckGo, not Google. And it's nice to avoid Google if you can. Anyway, it's in Patagonia, Arizona, not too far from the Mexican border. In fact, last time I went down there to visit, I got to drive through the Border Patrol checkpoint on the way. It was kind of an interesting experience. I'd just recently seen a program from Alex of, how the Border Patrol is not really allowed to check citizens and, make them get out of their car, all these things. And so, especially if it's not even at the border, and they're doing a lot of stuff that's not constitutional. However, it's really not the employee's fault. I mean, this is all being directed from high above. So they showed people's, videoing the encounter with Border Patrol and refusing to do anything and asking if they're detained and all that kind of stuff. And so I thought, wait a minute, I'm talking about all this other approach to things on the radio, so I actually should be doing what I'm talking about. So I just started thinking of the Border Patrol agents as personal friends, and not with this whole energy of confrontation or anything, because after all, it's totally not their fault. They're just basically doing what their bosses are telling them, and they have no awareness in general that it's anything that's not completely legitimate. So I was thinking about them in this other alternative, positive manner. And by the time I got there, they were just incredibly friendly and asking me what I was doing. And instead of saying, I'm not answering any questions, are you detaining me? And this kind of stuff, which is technically correct, but the recipe for spreading adversarial, not so good relations. And I said, oh yeah, I'm going to visit Dr. Cousens, and he asked me to come down there and give a talk, which he did to some people about meditation and other things they were doing with food. And they said, oh yeah, we know Gabriel, and this is the way to find him, because I had no idea at that point which direction to drive. And they gave me exact directions. On the way back, they asked me how it was, and we talked about the meditation. I mean, it was great. And it just kind of illustrated that we have other options than what's usually apparent. I have great respect for Alex Jones and his program and his project and what he's done. I'm always recommending that if you want the best overall source of news nationally and globally, and historical significance of what's going on, I really recommend to go and sign up for prisonplanet.tv. That's prisonplanet.tv, not .com, but .tv. Pay the $6 a month, which is really worth it. And I mean, I've paid that even when I've had practically no money to do anything. And it's an incredible source of information. However, there are things beyond what Alex is talking about. And one of them is, you can sometimes bring people on the side of the power structure over to your side. Alex actually does talk about this sometimes too, but many times you have the choice. You can become part of a confrontation, which of course is fine if you can't avoid it, but you can also take the same people and that you're about to encounter, and doing things that they don't even know you're doing, you can make a very different experience out of it. So that was incredible. I really enjoyed that, and I wanted to share it with all of you and say, see, I really am trying to actually do what I'm talking to you about. And it doesn't mean it'll always work, but it's a really uplifting experience when it does work. So that's where Gabriel Cousens, Dr. Cousens, is working most of the time at Tree of Life. I recommend reading about it, considering some of the programs they have, which are really good for cleansing and fasting and spiritual retreats and things like that. But he's also working in countries all over the world, and he's done nutritional programs, vegan programs, live food programs, educational teaching programs in many countries. And he's had an incredible positive effect on society in many different cultures. Teaches about nutrition and mental health too. I mean, he's a psychiatrist, actually. He did his residency in psychiatry back in I think it was back in the 60s when he was finishing medical school. And he's the author of many books, like some of which I've read. And he's wrote Conscious Eating, Conscious Parenting, and the one I mentioned about diabetes that I was talking about, There is a Cure for Diabetes. So he's teaching that nutrition affects physical health, it affects mental health, and if you use it correctly, then it can set you up for not only really good health and top immunity and not getting sick, having a totally different old age, but also that, and he agrees with me on this, that it sets the foundation, a strong enough foundation that you can then use to do your real work, which is not physical, it's internal. Although it affects things that happen to you physically too, like it did at that checkpoint where I didn't have to go through the am I being detained routine, but actually met some new friends who happened to be Border Patrol agents. And Dr. Cousens, over a long period, has become a good friend of ours and embodies really hope for humanity, which I greatly appreciate. And if more of the medical doctors would kind of use him as an example of the open-mindedness and the creativity and what you can do when you put these pieces of knowledge together, it would be a really different society in America and elsewhere. And it's not the fault of most medical doctors that they don't do what Dr. Cousens does, because when you go through medical school, I haven't been through medical school personally, but I have a lot of friends who have, and I've been through extensive so-called higher education. And it's a lot like cult training, cult, C-U-L-T. Like a long time ago, I met the head of the Moonies and some people involved in that, and I noticed that there's a common thread that runs through these indoctrination systems, and they use techniques like sleep deprivation, peer pressure, intense information overload, things that are obviously keys to the whole medical school experience, so that you have no time to question anything during your indoctrination or training. All you have time to do is frantically learn, absorb and memorize these pieces of information as fast as you possibly can. And you get frequently tested to see if you're really memorizing things and paying attention, and if you're not, you get thrown out. So in order to pass the tests, you can't give creative answers of your own choosing. You have to give the right answers according to the system. And by the time you get out, after years and years of doing that, running as fast as you can to keep up, lacking sleep, having your peers pressure you to make sure that you're going along with everything, it's very unlikely that you're going to be questioning the basic foundation of the structure, such as that vaccines are the most wonderful cutting-edge science and the most fantastic discovery of the last couple of centuries. You're not going to question that kind of stuff because you had to memorize it and repeat it and write it down on tests and use it to figure out other correct answers to things over and over and over and over again for years at high speed. And you're not going to question that. I mean, when you get your gold star after doing all those things, which is your degree and your license to use that stuff on other people in your business, if you question that, then you question the whole validity of your training. And that's out of the question for most doctors. It's not their fault. They are, supposed to think that way. And so when you run into one like Dr. Cousens that questions everything, which is supposed to be the real characteristic of science, is question everything, then this is extraordinary. You don't usually see that. Dr. Rima Labo is an example of it. Dr. Russell Blaylock, Dr. Suzanne Humphreys, Dr. Tim O'Shea. There's a lot of really great people like that, but they're a tiny, tiny minority of all the doctors graduating every year and coming into society and into business. So when you run into one that is this clear and has not been brainwashed at all. Got through the whole system, questioning his teachers as he went, doing his own groundbreaking work, and helping a lot of people, saving a lot of lives, from things like diabetes and other supposedly incurable conditions. It's something that should be valued. And I really recommend that you go and watch the YouTube video of Dr. Cousens putting, I think it was, I don't know, was it 20? I don't know, the number of people. There were a bunch of people that were selected to participate in an experimental program, and it was curing diabetes, and I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's really a great video that we got to put up on our site. Everybody should watch it and get inspired by it. It's like, maybe I'll remember the name of it. I don't know. Anyway, look up diabetes and Dr. Cousens on YouTube. See if you can find this. Maybe I'll think of it later. And in fact, I'll bring it up to you before the end of the show if I can think of what the name of it was. Anyway, that's why I was so happy that Dr. Cousens suggested that he come on our show every month for a year and share the information that's behind these insights and all the people that he's helped with these incurable conditions, supposedly. So that's who we're talking to today. You might want to get your paper and pencil ready or pen ready, because the information that he usually brings up in the past almost all of these discussions, the statistics are so incredible that my main brilliant comment during most of these discussions is, wow, is that right? Or just wow, and I can't help it. It's amazing the stuff that he brings up, and I expect that to start immediately. So let's go see what he has in mind for this week's discussion. And what he's going to talk about is the effect of environmental toxins on brain chemistry and how that affects behavior and how the problems that it causes can be solved. And then I'll talk to you right after that, because there's a bunch of important stuff I need to share with you. Okay, hi everybody, this is Richard Sachs, host for Lost Arts Radio, here again with you with our friend Dr. Gabriel Cousens, MD, who's one of those creative and brilliant and insightful MD friends that is giving us information that is incredibly valuable, mainly not just because it helps us understand what's going on, but because we can use it to help things get better. And you may remember that we were talking about what's going on with the damage, especially psychological and brain damage from vaccines and many other factors in the environment. And there's a long list of those, of course. We just happened to be talking specifically about vaccination when we ended last time. And so we're going to continue into that. We may recap just a little bit of the last things we mentioned, and then we'll get right into the next pieces of the puzzle. And we're hoping that when this is done, you'll take the entire set, which we'll try to put together and present in some convenient form for everybody, and use this information to enhance and upgrade your own personal lifestyle so that you can have a clearer mind, a more resistant body, high immune system, generally higher state of energy and well-being in your life, and also that should enable you to be more protective influence for your kids and people that you know that are receptive to the same understanding. So welcome, Dr. Cousens. Thanks a lot for coming back and continuing our discussion. It will be exciting to see where we go this time.
Well, as you know, in my book, Conscious Parenting, I had some grave concerns about some of the downsides of vaccinations. And I'm going to start there and review a little bit of what we covered, which takes us into violence. So recently in Germany, there was a confirmed link between vaccinations and severe childhood epilepsies. This is also done, confirmed by a doctor who since mysteriously died at the age of 49 in Canada. He was a brilliant researcher. And he also felt that there's often an epileptic seizure from the vaccinations. I can't think of his name right now, but you know his name.
Are you talking about the one that we posthumously had on our show?
Yes.
Yeah, that's Dr. Andrew Molden, a brain specialist.
Dr. Molden. So he basically is making a very clear point about vaccines and epilepsies. And I want to talk about, there's no question that this happens. We have febrile seizures, afebrile seizures, status epileptics, and various epilepsy syndromes that are clearly enhanced, worsened by, and caused by vaccinations that then become chronic. Now here's the point. Now looking at increase in violence, particularly in the American society, that the average time from a vaccination to an epileptic event was 24 hours for inactivated and 7.5 days for attenuated. And I think I mentioned that in our last session. I'm just trying to make the point, though, in terms of violence in a society. And I'm going to make a point now, is the U.S. does the most vaccinations. They did a study which came out of the U.S., just to get an overview, is that they did what we call safety and crime indexes. So in the Philadelphia ran a 65% crime and then 35% safety. They did both. And right behind that was Baltimore. And then you have Los Angeles. They're all like very high, in much more dangerous and very little safety. In Israel, where everybody is focused as if it's really dangerous, it's completely opposite. So Jerusalem has 28% danger and literally 72% safety. Tel Aviv.
Dr. Cousens, can you maybe I just didn't pay attention enough, but can you go again and tell us what this percentage scale comes from? Who's generating it? What does it mean?
It's a research group in the United States, and they studied safety and danger in different cities throughout the world.
All right.
And, for example, the highest in the whole thing is Johannesburg with 80% danger, 20% safety. Then comes the American cities. Philadelphia is 65% danger, meaning it's dangerous, and 35% safety rating. And then becomes Baltimore, which is 64% and 36% safety.
So I'm surprised that Johannesburg is worse than Chicago on their ratings.
It's way worse.
Okay.
Way worse.
Okay.
There's reasons. If you ever been to Johannesburg, you understand it's like a prison.
Yeah, I haven't.
I taught there, and everything's fenced in, and it's pretty intense. It's really serious chaos there. Okay. But in Israel, where everybody's focusing on being dangerous, you have Jerusalem, which is very low, 28% danger and 82% safety. And Tel Aviv is 32% danger and 68% safety. So it's all about how the perception in the news. What I'm doing is relating it to vaccinations here and violence. Okay? Mm-hmm. So what we're saying is increased rates of febrile seizures or convulsions are definitely associated with vaccinations, and that increases impulsivity and aggressiveness. And that's the key understanding of what I'm trying to say in terms of violence. Okay?
Okay.
And they study prison populations because that's where you have more concentration of that. And basically they had 5 to 10 times greater seizure disorder than the general population. And they had a study of 321 mostly white middle-class people, violent individuals, and 90% showed evidence of brain damage, including histories of epilepsy. So what I'm saying is that we're looking at violence in our society, and we need to kind of see it more than people have a bad attitude. We need to see that vaccinations and all the insults to the brain, the chemtrails, the GMOs, which are associated too, all these are creating changes in the brain that bring more violence to the society. That's the point I'm making here.
Okay.
Now, we'll go to ADHD. It's in the same realm. They prescribe, the psychiatrists and pediatricians prescribe a variety of drugs to the kids with ADHD. There is no real criteria for ADHD. That's a big problem. And who's normal or not, that line is very, very sketchy. And particularly if you're a little younger, what's normal for your age, but you're the youngest in that grade, may get diagnosed as ADHD, where you're actually age appropriate.
Okay, one quick question to interject in there is that originally I remember when they first started talking about this kind of psychological problem in elementary school kids quite a few years ago. At that time, they always called it ADD. So what is the difference between ADD and what they've further refined it down to later in ADHD?
It's basically all the same.
Okay.
Basically, it's such a broad category that normals are being diagnosed at, because if you happen to be a younger person in the grade, you're normal, but for that grade, you may be not in their idea of normal. So what's happening is normality, the normal range is being contracted down, and people are getting drugs for basically normal behavior.
Okay.
I look at myself. I was a little precocious and smarter than a lot of my teachers, and I would sit in the back room and just raise my hand and ask questions and bug the teacher because I was asking above their heads. That could have been a reason to get drugged. You see what I mean?
Yeah, would make it right. So the system doesn't want too much energy.
Right. I got, from every single teacher, I got a check in self-control. Okay. But I was just being expressive and creative and a little smarter than the teachers.
Yeah. In other words, the normal state is...
Not in a disrespectful way.
No, the normal state is to be excited about life, which you were.
Exactly. That was what was going on. It was just like, I loved learning, I loved asking questions, but the teachers didn't feel so comfortable with that.
Right.
And then I would just raise my hand and talk. I wasn't the perfect student in that way.
Yeah.
Self-control, but what I'm saying is that's all it was. No big deal. I didn't get in trouble for it, except for my parents. But the point was that today would get you drugged.
Yeah, okay.
So normal behavior within the range is at risk. Okay. So now here's the thing that's not so good about it is adolescents suffering from neurological disorders and brain damage, okay, this is all the thing we're talking about. It's not just vaccines again, it's chemtrails and a lot of things, are at risk for in early smoking, drinking, and substance abuse because their brains are off. And I'll explain why that is in just a moment. And adults with these problems have a lot of alcoholism and the misuse of drugs as well. This is no accident, they're real reasons. But violent crime, mass murder is more prevalent in our society than ever before, and that's kind of what I'm getting at. Vaccines play a role, but it's only one of multiple things going on in our society.
Okay.
But people that commit violent crimes are significantly more likely than nonviolent people to have a brain damage or other neurological things like seizures, and that is in a main way set off by vaccines. That's what I'm saying. So the compulsory vaccine programs may be contribute to a culture of violence, besides all kinds of other problems. But my point is a bigger point. Let's look at violence and why is that increasing. It's not just politics. It's not just poverty. We're really talking about real problems here. And here there's an increasing violence, going on. Vaccinations are involved, GMO are involved, irradiated foods are involved, poor U.S. dietary guidelines, high rates of vaccinations. I mentioned the flow of pharmaceuticals into kids' life. All these are making a difference. Radiation exposure, kids being exposed to pharmaceutical drugs in the embryo, in the womb, antipsychotics, antidepressants, anti-anxieties, ADHD, are all disturbing brain function. They're suppressing it, but they're disturbing it. And that's the key. And that's what we have to look at. This is a big problem. Radiation exposure, because it oxidizes the brain, legalize chemtrails, and then they get a little older, use of psychotropics, LSD, cocaine, ayahuasca, amphetamines, marijuana. Their kids 8 years old having marijuana, ecstasy, magic mushrooms. All those things alter the brain. So what we're looking at in a few years, maybe 60 to 70% of American children will be chronically ill, with more obesity, more infertility. But the chronic illnesses, what I'm looking at, is really a huge problem, and the violence that's associated with it. So what we're seeing is the degeneration of our society worldwide, but really leading in the United States. So in the U.S., it's the highest use of alcohol and drug in the world. Believe it or not, Americans consume at a minimum of 5 billion tranquilizers per year. It's amazing. 1/3 of high school students are involved in some kind of drug abuse. Hold on. It's kind of like out of hand. And I think I mentioned this last time, but there's about 2.7 gallons of pure alcohol per person imbibed per year. 2.2 million people in the U.S. use cocaine. 100,000 kids ages 10 to 11 get drunk weekly. I mean, this is serious degeneration.
Right.
So now I want to expand it to more biochemical and genetic understanding, because this is what I call the addictive brain syndrome. I write about it in my book in Conscious Eating in 1990. We have to go beyond the moral and psychological approaches, which is a key insight. Okay, drug abuse, alcohol abuse is a complex psychosocial, spiritual problem, and you have to ask the question, which we're going to answer: why is alcoholism for men 5 times greater than it is for women? Why is illicit drug use for men 2 to 3 times greater than for women? Okay, so these are questions that have to be answered, and we do have an answer. Male addicts are more described as antisocial. Female addicts are more depressed.
Right.
So we're looking at that whole thing. Hold on just a second. Okay. The death rate from suicide among alcoholics, accidents, and cirrhosis is 10 times higher than normal. That's an amazing kind of statistic. And alcoholics lose 20 years off their life. And in the general population, 63% of all the people who are arrested have illegal drugs in their urine. So it's like, this is a big deal. Okay. And what I'm going to say is that alcoholism is more of a genetically activated disease than a personality disorder. So how do we come about to that statement, which is contrary, in a sense, to how we're how people would like to see it? Oh, it's a moral problem. Well, the research shows that if you're an identical twin and one twin is alcoholic, the other one has a 4 times greater chance of being alcoholic. Okay? They did a study of adoptees in Sweden. Okay, and it's the same principle. Is that the ones who are adopted, even though they were in a non-alcoholic home, if their parent was an alcoholic, their chance of being alcoholic was 3 times greater than children who were parents of non-alcoholics. This is a clear genetic thing. There's a study by Goodwin in 1973. It's not new information. They took 133 sons of alcoholics who were adopted and raised by non-alcoholics, and then they did with kids parents were non-alcoholic raised by him, and the sons of the alcoholic biological parents had an alcohol rate 3 times greater. So we are looking very seriously at a genetic component. As I point this out, I think, in our last talk, but I'm just reviewing it. And in 1984, our researcher at Harvard, George Valiant, studied 650 alcoholics, and what he found was that the sons of recovering alcoholics had neurocognitive defects like their fathers. The sons of alcoholics have a risk of early age of developing craving for addictive drugs such as nicotine, marijuana, and alcohol. In other words, it's a genetic issue. And then it's further biochemically altered with vaccines and chemtrails and so forth. And so there's more and more compulsive craving disorders for sex, food, gambling, as well as drugs. And so basically what I'm saying is that there's a biologically altered brain from genetic predisposition, environmental, including all the things we're talking about in your environment, and allopathic stress such as vaccines. Okay. So now we're seeing a kind of a bigger picture of and that helps us understand it. Now I'm going to go a little bit about marijuana, and there are THC sites in the brain, and we see that marijuana increases dopamine neurotransmission and a little bit opioid receptors. Now that's important because the key to this mystery of why men versus women, more men are alcoholic and drug addicts, is they have lower dopamine production. They have a D2A1 allele, and they need more dopamine stimulation, which you get with drugs. That's the story. Women do not have that problem to the same extent. So alcohol particularly works on the dopamine release at the, I'm going to call it the nucleus accumbens. It's a pleasure center place. And so people are looking for pleasure, and they don't have a very good production of it themselves, so they go to drugs.
So men actually produce less dopamine than women?
Well, not exactly. So dopamine is like the most important hormone for men in this range. Serotonin is the most important for women.
Okay.
So women need serotonin as an antidepressant, anti-stress, anti-sense of well-being. The serotonin really is good. And their problem with dopamine is not as much, partly because they don't depend on it as they do on serotonin. Men, on the other hand, really do depend on dopamine function to feel good. And if they don't have that, then they go to other things that stimulate, which includes violence, which includes, drugs, alcohol. Alcohol is a drug, but it includes drugs, alcohol, and sexual obsessions and so forth, or gambling. All these things raise the dopamine, okay? And that's the key. Alcohol, in addition, stimulates GABA, which has a Valium-like effect, so it kind of relaxes you a little bit, too. And this works mostly in the emotional centers, which we call the limbic system, in specific the nucleus accumbens and hippocampus, which are the reward pleasure centers. Okay? And that's what we're talking about. How do you get your reward pleasure centers to work? And we can understand major problems in our society. Healthy people don't have that problem. They produce enough dopamine that they don't need to go to drugs. Okay? And that's the key. So these genetic defects that are made worse by environmental problems and allopathic things like vaccines all add up to men particularly producing less dopamine and needing to do things. So these defects have to do with the structure and function of the physical dopamine receptors and their ability to release and also ultimately bind in the post-neuroreceptor sites dopamine. And literally the number of dopamine sites, all those are affected. So now we kind of start to see a bigger picture for what this drug addiction thing is about. So people are obviously attracted to these psychoactive drugs with, morphine, cocaine, amphetamines, alcohol, sugar, big player, marijuana, because they're temporarily induced release of high amounts of dopamine. And it makes people feel better. Okay? Mm-hmm. If they are suffering from a biologically altered brain, so they offset the low pleasure, the low dopamine experience. And that's kind of the overview for us to understand this whole addiction thing in a non-psychological way. Mm-hmm. So we're experiencing an epidemic of drug and alcohol abuse, which really can be more related to neurotransmitter defects, okay, genetics rather than psycho-spiritual problem. Now what happens is when you do these psychoactive drugs and alcohol long enough, it actually disrupts the pathways on their own. So now the relief only works for a short time, and then you get into a chronic thing, which you're even worse. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That the neurological function of the brain is even worse secondary to these things. So it's a short-term, I'm going to say relief, but in the long term it makes things worse. So we're looking at poor nutrition, malnutrition, basically that's what's happening in this country. People are overweight, they're obese, but it's malnutrition, okay, which we get with fast foods, GMO food, junk food, high sugar diets, synthetic foods, heavily pesticide and herbicided foods, radiation exposure. They all create the preconditions of an altered brain neurochemistry, which takes us into an addictive brain. And of course, obviously mentioned vaccines do create brain inflammation up to 2 years and are associated with a much higher rate of seizure disorders post-vaccine. So when we look at all the research, and I use alcohol as a model because a lot of research has been done in that area, this craving is associated with the problem of the reward centers of the brain, a lot of the neurotransmitters, enzymes that control them. So that's, and hundreds of experiments suggest that craving for alcohol, other drugs, sugar, to a major extent, are a result of these neuronal transmission defects, are really, in essence, a poorly functioning pleasure center. So that is kind of an overview. And in addition to the addictive brain, we're also looking at the hyperactivity, how we want to label it, which 50 to 75% can be treated easily. If you just go organic, 50% are treated. This is what we saw at what I see clinically all the time. And then I add a bunch of other things, and it gets up to 90%. But I'm not the only one. There are other holistic doctors doing that. Okay?
Right.
But really my message is today's modern diet creates, and vaccinations and lifestyle, creates the environmental conditions that predisposes children to developing addictive brain neurochemistry.
Okay.
And make our kids susceptible to the plague of alcohol, psychoactive and recreational drugs, and other compulsive disorders like, sex addiction.
Let me ask a question about that point just for a second. We talked about marijuana being one of the drugs that has some negative effects along with all the rest of the group that you just went through. What about, speaking of natural holistic doctors, some of them are recommending a substance called CBD, non-THC component.
Yeah, that's not what we're talking about. We are talking about THC.
Okay, okay. So CBD can actually be positive, in other words.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Cancer, for pain, totally different discussion.
Okay, yeah, just wanted to clarify that.
Link that discussion together, they're really not connected in the big picture.
Okay, got it.
It's a THC issue.
Okay.
And so basically, what I've discovered is through proper live food nutrition, going organic, total holistic lifestyle, we can repair these disrupted neurotransmitter pathways. Now, that's an important thing. When I say repair, yes, it functions better. If people go off it, then they tend to slip back into these, addiction habits. But if you can stay on a live food diet, it naturally will increase your neurotransmitter production. That's the good news.
Okay.
So we can get around this. We get off nicotine, sugar, caffeine, and if we eat a low glycemic, organic, vegan, live food diet, really a lot of this can be reversed and maintained in a pretty healthy, non-addictive state. And that's the beauty of it. Because something about live foods, which I don't know, all I can do is give an observation, significantly increases the neurotransmitter and decreases the cravings. Up to at least 32%. I suspect it's more than that because when I put people on this plus the neurotransmitter precursors, they really are able to stay drug and alcohol free. So it's kind of exciting.
Do you think that the positive brain effects are correlated to the positive gut effects and maybe even a secondary result of them?
Yeah, the answer is yes, and I think we're learning more about the whole gut type thing, but the biodome is very important because a lot of the neurotransmitters are produced in the intestine. A lot. In fact, there are certain probiotics that actually stimulate production of serotonin and dopamine. It's pretty impressive. So it's kind of exciting. So you have to have a healthy gut because your gut produces more neurotransmitters than your brain does.
Okay.
That's new information. I mean, it's not that new, but the point is, you got to have a healthy gut. And now there's another side, as I say, it gets more chronic. So you get temporary relief, but not chronically. Chronically, you get more degeneration. And what we see is serious nutritional deficiencies can result from alcohol abuse. Now, you can go real far, called Wernicke syndrome, where there's a breakdown in the brain from B vitamin deficiencies. It's severe neurological problems, memory loss, mental confusion, and so forth. So all these things can really happen, but we lose real nutrients and minerals such as zinc, chromium, manganese, magnesium, calcium, copper, iron, as well as all the B vitamins. That has a very negative effect on brain function. They alter the brain biochemistry, and that's where we're talking the long-term breakdown is what happens when you're doing these drugs over a long time. And we got to replace those nutrient deficiencies if we're going to heal the brain. That's the key.
Right.
So I'm going to share now kind of a model, which I've already been alluding to, but I'm summarizing it. There's three major forces involved in the biologically altered brain. One is genetics. As I mentioned, it's pretty significant. Then interrupted genetic forces from a weakened germplasm of the parents and result of poor prenatal nutrition. So if the parents are coming in with toxins and drug use and so forth, then whatever genetic forces are there are going to be depleted. And plus poor prenatal nutrition. Prenatal means before you get pregnant. So if the sperm and ovum are already depleted nutritionally and energetically, they're already coming in with a lower genetic picture. So the epigenetic is compromised, is what that means. Then we have the environmental forces that are acting. Okay, poor diet, stress, allergy-causing chemicals, vaccinations. Now, particularly when they start vaccinating pregnant mothers, it's like, well, this is close to absurd because these vaccines really, some of them, like the flu vaccine, which doesn't work anyway, has 25 times more mercury than is allowable. So these kids are getting a neural poisoning in utero. So even the development is damaged. So we're kind of looking at this addictive brain syndrome as a societal problem that's much bigger, and we're directly contributing to it through our poor environment, poor nutrition. So you have a genetic predisposition, but it's like, well, there's much more to the story. We're pushing it. So in 1990, Dr. Kenneth Bloom and Ernest Noble, Dr. Ernest Noble found that there was a gene called the D2 receptor gene, and a less common form of that gene called the A1 allele, which is kind of it's a variation of the gene. And this D2 A1 allele was found in much higher association with people who are alcoholic versus non-alcoholic brains. In fact, they found it in 69% of alcoholics as compared to 24% in non-alcoholics. So there really is a gene that's being negatively affected. And this gene affects the pleasure-reward cascade in our brain, in which I've been talking about, which is the dopamine. So, making it simple, when this reward cascade is working, and normal healthy people have a normal healthy kind of in utero and post utero upbringing, without all the junk food, vaccinations, and so forth, it's more likely that it's going to work better. Okay? And we weren't always this way. In 1990, the rate of before 1943, there was no autism. Period. They began the vaccinations. As much as people wanted to deny it, there's a very direct correlation between vaccinations and autism. Once they begin vaccinations, then they begin to notice a new disease called autism. Okay, but in 1990, it was still 1 in 10,000. At our present time, and it varies, the estimates, but it's 1 in 60 and 1 in 42 boys. Okay, so what we're saying is we are progressively decreasing proper neurobiological functioning by what we're doing to our children and how we're living as parents, even prenatally. So it's a very important statement when we're talking about conscious parenting. Well, that begins before you have a kid. That begins before you get pregnant. And I routinely advise people, clean up your diet, clean up your lifestyle, give yourself a year for your body to come back into a higher epigenetic function, because that's what gets transmitted in the DNA, the epigenetics as well as genetics.
Okay.
So I try to detox people and so forth. These are really big issues, okay? The average kid today is born umbilical cord in the United States with 287 toxins, 217 are neurotoxins, 180 of them are carcinogens. So it's not like we're exaggerating here. So when these reward cascades are working right, you have a sense of pleasure and ease. When it's not working, there's anxiety, cravings, and a sense of discomfort, which is what we're seeing in our society.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's going on. And it's a tragedy. So those that Noble and Bloom, again in 1990, found that those with an A1 allele had 1/3 fewer dopamine receptors in the brain. That means your ability to pick up the dopamine was compromised by 1/3. That's a lot.
Okay, I have a question about that allele. And the allele means one variant of a gene, right? And,
correct.
And my question is, I'm assuming they found this in a blood test, and the question.
Well, they found it measuring the DNA.
Okay.
And then they found it by examining the brains of people who died, with autopsies.
Okay, so the question is, the whole premise, or one of the main ones in epigenetics, if I understand it right, is that genes turn on and off through very subtle influences all the time. I mean, constantly.
That's definitely one part of the story.
Oh, okay, but they turn on and off. So how do they know that the appearance of the A1 allele is stable and not a condition that's currently an epigenetic state?
What they is my understanding of the research when I'm talking about the 63%, 69%, is they're actually checking the DNA and not the epigenetic program. And then they're showing very constant numbers. It's about a third less, from the parent to the son. It doesn't seem to get transferred to the daughter.
Okay.
So I think they know it then literally by doing genetic testing.
All right.
So here's the thing. So the A1 allele, the D2 receptor, that gene change was significantly associated with severe alcoholism and other forms of drug abuse. That's what we know, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So, and does it get worse? Yeah, but we're talking in a way across the board in terms of that, and that this is really a genetic issue, not an epigenetic issue. I think that's what we're talking about.
Okay.
And there are roughly 30 million children of alcoholics in the U.S., and their genetic tendency is that they're going to develop alcoholism and drug abuse at a rate about 4 times greater than those of children of non-alcoholics, and that has to do with this genetic transmission.
So they're going to feel agitated, unsatisfied, irritated, etc., until they drink alcohol, and then they'll notice that they feel better.
Temporarily.
Yeah,
or
that's what
until they do a live food vegan diet.
Okay.
Which then makes it more permanent. We have a cure for this. Okay.
Okay.
We have a way to minimize it. I'll say that. But this gene is different than epigenetic. Is the actual gene structure, which is different than the epigenetic program above the gene structure. They're born with this gene structure. It doesn't switch.
Okay. Okay.
So now there's another doctor, Dr. David Cummings. He took 850 patients and again found the D2A1 allele was present in 40 to 55% of the patients with Tourette's syndrome, ADHD, autism, and post-traumatic stress disorder. So we are looking again at, yes, we have drug abuse and alcoholism, but now a little bit less percentage. Instead of 69%, we're looking at 40 to 55%. So there's a genetic weakness. So people who get the ADHD, autism, post-traumatic stress syndrome are already kind of predisposed to these problems. Then our environment and our whole system and the vaccines all tip it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's what we're looking at. So this is what Cummings felt, is he didn't think the D2A1 was not the cause, that played a role in the degree of expression. And this is where we're talking about epigenetic. Does it get expressed or doesn't? So you give, for example, you give a kid a vaccine, and it activates the expression of the autism tendency. They have the tendency to begin with, but it doesn't have to activate if you're not vaccinating them, you give them healthy food, and you're not environmentally predisposed. Now, we do see that, for example, if you live within 1,000 feet of a highway, your pregnant mother, you have I think it's an increase in 10% of your children being autistic. Follow what I'm saying? That's, I think, an understatement, but you get what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
Not just vaccinations, it's any kind of biochemical stress put on somebody who's a weaker genetics to begin with.
Right.
That's what we're talking about. And it has that predisposition with the D2A1 gene. So it's a very important concept to get. So, and then our job, and if we're going to protect our kids with conscious parenting, is truly protecting themselves from that tendency.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a parent who has hyperactivity and all, don't give them a vaccination, because you're more likely to turn on and activate the D2A1 allele in a way that it manifests.
toxic synergy. You have to watch out more for it with the weakness there, because it's going to give the people more of a feeling that they need something to compensate, like drugs, for example.
Exactly. So there is an overlap between ADHD or hyperactivity or whatever we want to call, that category, and alcoholism, because they're in a continuum. About 1/3 of alcoholics also meet the definition of ADHD.
Wow.
And alcoholics tend to have a higher history, a higher rate of childhood ADHD. So there is an overlap, and that's the thing we can't really, and we don't even want to ignore. We need to look at, oh, wow, this is what's going on. And so it's on the parents to pay attention. Well, I'm ADHD. Well, I better keep my kid on an organic diet to begin with. Avoid vaccinations, because those vaccinations or the pesticides and herbicides or the environmental pollution can set off. It can activate the D2A1 allele into its full expression, which is not what you want.
You talked about autism starting to be diagnosed, I think you said around 1943 or something like that. And
that's immediately, it was around the time when the pertussis vaccine was given.
Yeah. And so do we know when they started diagnosing ADD or ADHD? I don't know. Because I was just looking for correlation.
When I was in medical school in the 60s, we didn't. That word wasn't used. Even autism wasn't even used.
Okay.
So it had to be 70s and 80s and things like that.
Yeah, I just remember in the 50s, when I was in school on those levels, nobody had ADD, and I don't think we ever heard of ADD at that time.
That's what I'm trying to say. And even in the 60s, at Coleman Medical School, they didn't really talk about it.
Yeah.
So it's probably more in the 70s, 80s, 90s where,
Yeah, so you're talking about younger parents. Parents of fairly young kids. Okay. All right.
So the dopamine, the neurotransmitter systems that are most easily disrupted are the dopaminergic system, the GABA system, serotonin, and glutamine. So I kind of mentioned all those. Dopamine is more pleasure, GABA is more relaxation, serotonin is kind of pleasure, antidepressant in the sense of well-being in a different way. Glutamine is more kind of activation, clarity of mind, and so forth.
Okay.
Now, here's the good news. I want to really keep stressing it. Even if you didn't get it right as a parent and you let your kids get vaccinated, we can heal the damage from these things through the biochemical repair upgrade of the biologically altered brain, which is the key part of the whole story.
Which is mainly lifestyle issues, right?
A live food, organic diet, and then specific treatment. Quite honestly, we can go organic, and you're going to eliminate 50% of your hyperactivity, ADHD. Okay, 50%. Mm-hmm. Use homeopathy. Use a good, live food, vegan diet. You're going to get yourself up to 75 to 90% eliminated without drugs. We don't suffer from a Ritalin deficiency. So how do you repair it? There's 2 steps to repairing it. This is my big interest. It's like, how do we, on a societal level? Well, we have to avoid detrimental environmental toxins, vaccines, alcohol, prescription drugs, sugar, nicotine, caffeine, psychoactive and recreational drugs, and allergens. Because they all make it worse. They overstimulate, but then they make it worse in the long run. Okay? Then we got to restore the vitamin, mineral, and pH balance, neurotransmitter deficits, which I use with when I say our neurotransmitter building blocks, and that's what we have to do to build it up and avoid these things. So those are your 2 steps. Okay. Now, I'm going to give you an example of the difference, which is, again, a study in alcoholism. So there was a center in Minnesota who took a pretty holistic approach, and they gave their alcoholics a lot of good nutrition, vitamins, minerals, so it's kind of a standard input, okay? And after 6 months, 92% of their alcoholic population they were treating was off alcohol. And for the next 3.5 years, 75% remain off alcohol. That's very high. Let me explain what I mean very high. Then they compare that result with, I compare with 617 traditional alcohol treatment programs, and the average abstinent rate after 1 year is 25%. So one's 92 and one's 25%. And after 3.5 years, it was 7% success rate versus 75% with a nutritional holistic program.
Well, can you say any more detail about the protocol those guys were using?
Well, basically they gave B vitamins, vitamin C, vitamin E, things like that.
Okay.
You know, basically basic nutritional thing. It wasn't really that complicated.
So they didn't change their diet that much, right?
Not really.
Okay.
That's what I take from the study. They just gave them this nutrition. I think they cut down on the sugar.
Okay.
And basically we're looking, again, somewhere between 28 to 25% being abstinent in the first year, and then another study says only 4% were abstinent after 4 years versus 7%. And I mentioned the other studies that I mentioned that were, 617. Now, this is more important. The suicide rate among the abstinent who were not on the nutritional support system was as high as the rate among the active alcoholics. In other words, being off alcohol did not change anything. Okay? But being on the appropriate vitamins, minerals, just the basics, okay? Not sophisticated, just what they did to everybody, treated the same.
Mm-hmm.
There was a significant decrease in anxiety and depression by 90% approval. And basically they just did overall picture 3 to 10 times better. So what's my point? The biologically addicted brain can be biologically repaired so people can have a full life expression and spiritual expression. Now, that's a big statement. So you're not stuck, and you don't have to white knuckle it. And AA is really good to support the psychological and spiritual. Initially in AA, they did give B vitamins, but somehow that got lost along the way and replaced it with coffee and donuts.
Wow.
Which unfortunately is true, okay, because they replaced it with sugar, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Sugar raises the dopamine.
So what you're saying is that the nutritional supplements are incredibly helpful in situations like that.
They repair the system.
Right.
And we're looking at a 90% difference here,
All right.
So basically, if you're going to treat an alcoholic, you have to increase the endorphin levels, which come from the dopamine. To do that, you have to repair the neurotransmitter pathways. To do that, you have to have the proper nutrition. Okay? Now, we're not an alcohol center here, and if somebody has to withdraw, they're going to do that at a detox center. But here's the important thing. Then there are certain things that can make a huge difference. So one of them is D-L-phenylalanine, which then goes to dopamine. But the D-phenylalanine blocks the breakdown of the encephalases. What does that mean? It raises the endorphins because encephalases are enzymes that break down the endorphins. So if the D-phenylalanine breaks down the encapsulase, that means you're going to have a higher endorphin level for a longer time. So D-L-phenylalanine is a really important component here. in this treatment. L-phenylalanine increases the amount of dopamine in norepinephrine system and increases the regrowth of dopamine receptors. Remember what I said? They have about the D2A1 allele has about 1/3 the amount of dopamine receptors. See what I'm saying? So now we're building it back with the L-phenylalanine, and so that's a big player.
That's one of the supplements that you're talking about, then, right?
Yeah, it's one I'm talking about. They didn't use it in this Minnesota program.
Right. No, you're just saying it's one that would do a lot of good. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Once people are off, okay, and they're going through there with immediate withdrawal, we're not set up here at the tree to do that.
Okay.
So, and then 88% of alcoholics have hypoglycemia because they're, the whole sugar thing is another way to raise the dopamine.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and a certain amount of alcoholics, this is more like the Scottish genetic background, have a defect in the conversion of the long-chain omega-3s to PGE, progesterone 1. What does that mean? Well, because PGE1 is specifically antidepressant. Okay, so this is, you got to understand, alcohol plays roles that people are intuitively tuning in. Alcohol helps convert the long-chain omega-3s into PGE1, particularly in people who do not absorb the essential fatty acids very well, but it not only works for a short time, and eventually they become deficient in the long-chain omega-3s. So in this subgroup, gamma-linolenic acid, which you get in primrose oil, helps resolve it because people have a predisposition that they can't convert the EPAs, or they don't absorb well. So that ups the amount of EPAs that then go to PG1, if that makes sense, and PG1 has an antidepressant effect. So one study in Scotland, where this is a acknowledged problem, with two groups with the genetic defect, both were 50% lower in their EPA, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So there was an 83% success rate in their sobriety, that's what we're talking about, when they were given primrose oil, which again has the GLA, gamma-linolenic acid. So the 83% success rate versus a 28% with the control group. So that's significant. So it's just a little complicated. The Scottish is a little bit more complicated. And a lot of people, it's definitely a problem. I'll just put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a thing that can really help. In addition, 73% of alcoholics have allergies to wheat, dairy, rye, potatoes, and grapes, which are made, and from which most alcohols are made. So what does that mean? Well, if you have an allergy, you often go after what you're allergic to.
Yeah.
That's another thing that pushes the alcoholic drive. So if you're going to really go full on with this, you got to check for wheat, dairy, rye, potatoes, and grapes. That stuff, and avoid them if you're allergic.
Do you know why, in general, people have a extra craving for things they're allergic to?
No.
Just think that's interesting.
No, we just know that it happens.
Yeah, I've seen it.
It's more on a clinical way of understanding. Well, maybe somebody knows. I don't know.
Okay.
So, and so we have 73% who are, allergic to wheat and so forth, and 55% are allergic to gasoline, plastics, paints, and art supplies. Well, there we go again. You get exposed to that, you end up getting back into alcohol. It sets it off. Mm-hmm. So they tend to drink to cope with their allergies.
Okay.
So what's the total program for alcoholism? Simple. Avoid detrimental substances, obviously alcohol, drugs, sugar, nicotine, caffeine, vaccines, and so forth. Build up your endorphins and neurotransmitter deficiencies, whether environmental or genetic. We can build it up, like I mentioned, with replacing all the nutritional deficiencies. rebuilding the endocrine system because of the hypoglycemia. And then the AAA psychospiritual support, they all go hand in hand. But just the psychospiritual only gives you 4 to 7% after 4 years versus 75%. So there's a big difference. You had a question?
I mean, it's kind of a silly question in a way, but I know a lot of people would bring up the response that, well, look, you're telling people to avoid vaccines because of all these dangerous, bad effects from the vaccines, to be on the programs that you're suggesting, and so, but you never talk about, if you don't have vaccines, what are you going to replace them with so that you keep immune to all these diseases that are going to kill you?
Well, there's so many. I know it's a setup question, okay? So first of all, these diseases aren't going to kill you. They're very, basically they're acute diseases. 99.99% you're not going to have a problem. Okay, you will survive mumps, you will survive measles. I had all those, as a kid. So it's like, they're not life-threatening. There's more to it because in the long run, vaccinations, this is newer research, have been associated with increased rates of cancer at a different age. There's lots of pieces to that. I'm not going to that will take us on the whole vaccine.
Right. That's okay.
Okay, but I'm just making that point there. Second, there's the obvious. Vaccines don't work so well. What we know is from 1900 to basically 1940s, the rate of all these acute diseases pretty much went down from like 100% type thing to 1 or 2%, way before vaccines came out, and it was related to better hygiene and health. And the serious doctors out there have actually studied it. There are definitely papers making that point. So pretty much these rates were almost, were very low. It's possible that the vaccines dropped at 1 or 2%. It's possible with that. I would say yes, maybe even in some cases 4%. So we're not really worried about it. What's the third thing? Build up your immune system. This is not complicated. 85% of the public is deficient in vitamin D. Well, vitamin D is one of the best protection against all acute and chronic diseases, as well as cancer, 70% of cancer. Well, that's not bad. Add more zinc. It builds up your immune system. Add more vitamin C. Builds up your immune system. If you just do a few things like that, and you can take immune supportive herbs, the best combination of Chinese herbs is Mega Defense. The people I work with, they don't get sick. The kids don't get sick. Don't get all these acute things. And it's because they have an adequately functioning immune system, whereas vaccines depress the immune system.
Right.
Besides everything else, all the people keep focusing on autism. That's really not the big problem. It's clearly a problem. The big problem is the chronic degenerative inflammation that gets set off, where your rates of all your kind of chronic diseases, asthma, allergies, kind of like low-grade chronic fatigue, poor mental functioning, all those are increased. I'm talking about things that don't hit the news. What hits the news is autism, epilepsy, Guillain-Barré, where your whole neurological system demyelates. That's dramatic. But the bulk of the kids really suffer from these other things. And it's like depending, and I won't go through everything, it's like a tenfold increase in allergies, asthma, hay fever, immune deficiency diseases. So kids aren't thriving, and that's what we're really seeing. And so we have something that does work. You don't need to take that risk. These vaccines, they're told to be safe and effective. They're not effective, and it's getting worse. And I won't go into it's getting worse, but I'll just say in China, where they have like 99% people being vaccinated for measles, the rate of measles increased last year by since 2011, increased by 300% each year.
Wow.
But there's more to it because they did computer. This is all my book on conscious parenting. They did kind of computer projections, and they're really saying by 2015 we're going to get a backlash. We're going to see an ecological shift where the vaccines are really now associated with increased rates. You know, whether the viruses have mutated is unclear, you know, but that's what the computer projections. Now, that's interesting. So we're saying this is making it worse now, not better.
Right. Okay.
Besides all the contaminants, I mean, it goes on and on. So they're not safe, and they're not really effective, and they're going to get less effective. I think it was Sabine talked about the polio vaccine and said Salk actually said it, that the polio vaccine is the main cause of polio since 1979.
Right.
Vaccine. And you can track that out in a variety of societies where they introduced that there's an outbreak of polio, where they didn't have it before, like in Nigeria, where people were very upset about it. Anyway, those are kind of overview.
Okay.
You know, so people can easily protect themselves by being healthy. Eat a good organic diet and take your vitamin D and C and zinc. And some, if you want some, you know, immune supportive Chinese herbs like Mega Defense. So it's not a problem. So what we're also seeing is when you work with people in an alcoholic program and you do give nutritional supplements, the dropout rate for the program drops from 37.5% to 4.2%. So people are really there. They're more able to heal themselves. Is 9 times more effective. That's significant. Again, alcoholism is a model for understanding the biologically altered brain and what can be done. The treatment isn't so different. Generally, alcoholics have a 3 times higher mortality rate than the population. And here's the problem. The sober alcoholics without the nutritional support or the psychospiritual continue to suffer from the causes that brought them to alcohol in the first place, which is D2A1 allele, lower dopamine, and endorphin pleasure center activation. So they continue to suffer. So it's not good. I mean, you're not degenerating from alcohol. So they have same rates of depression, anxiety, insomnia, irritability, and lack of joy before they started alcohol, because we haven't fixed the problem. We just took them off alcohol.
Okay, one thing you just said now is that the alcoholics have the higher mortality rate, right? Without this being fixed. And I just wanted you to clarify for people who may not hear that term all the time. They know that mortality rate for human beings is pretty much 100%. So what does that mean when they say it's a higher mortality rate?
It's per age. So for 50-year-olds, if you're alcoholic, you're going to have a 3 times higher rate of death.
So they die later in life, is what you're saying, right?
Well, no. I'm saying that at whatever age you're talking about, their rate of death is 3 times higher.
Right, but when you make a general statement, like alcoholics have a higher mortality rate, what does that actually mean?
It means that whatever age you're looking at, your rate of dying is 3 times greater. So whatever age you look at, what's the rate of people dying at 60? Well, it's 10. If you're alcoholic, it's going to be 30.
So your chances of making it to whatever year is next for you are lower if you're an alcoholic.
Correct.
Okay. All right.
That's how they talk about it.
Yeah. Good. Thanks.
Now, I just want to make a point here that sobriety does protect you from the disaster of chronic alcoholism, but it doesn't really exactly make you better. And now in our society, post-traumatic stress disorder is another player. In World War II, it was 5%. Korean War was 10%. In the present, endless wars that we're in Afghanistan, it's now 50%. Afghanistan and Iraq is now post-traumatic stress is 50%. That's very impressive. It's the same principle, okay? Same principle. that when you have healthy amounts of opioids and endorphins, you don't get this problem. And enkephalin, it gets confusing, is an opioid. And when people have normal enkephalin levels, they don't go into post-traumatic stress disorder. The stress damages your ability to make neurotransmitters. You just see it that way, and it gets very clear. So if you already are low and you get damaged, your ability to recover is a lot less, and you stay in a post-traumatic stress disorder, which is really a neurotransmitter deficit. And a lot of people are working it out with psychological things, and all that helps. But it's the same principle. You've got to build up the neurotransmitter systems that have been suppressed in order to cope with the stress. Now, I'll give you a simple way of looking at it, because this came out with Russians in World War II fighting the Germans, is that a great number of them, after Stalingrad, developed what we would call today post-traumatic stress disorder, and they end up a higher rate of alcoholism. Okay, now let's take everything we've learned and make it real simple. When you're under stress, your body is going to suppress your dopamine and endorphins, which is getting high and feeling relaxed and feeling good, because it doesn't help you defend yourself. It's going to push the epinephrine, norepinephrine, your stress hormones, because that's what you need to survive. This is normal. But if you do it long enough, your normal well-being, opioids, endorphins, and so forth, that whole pleasure center is actually damaged. And that's where you're getting your post-traumatic stress, because you don't have enough well-being neurotransmitters to bring you out. So normally when anybody goes into a stress situation, okay, you decrease your endorphins immediately in your opioids, because that's not good survival, and you increase norepinephrine and epinephrine. And stress passes, and then your normal pleasure centers start to work again. That's normal. But when under chronic stress, if you already have, let's say, the genetic weakness, which is increasing in our society, then you don't recover. You stay downgraded, and you're not really able to produce the normal dopamine and endorphins to improve your sense of well-being, and then you stay in a chronic stress disorder. Is that clear? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just think it's interesting that you brought up, opioids and endorphins and things like that as things that you're supposed to produce in a healthy state so that you keep feeling good. But it's also true that externally supplied opioids through various drugs can be one of the leading causes of death. So that it brings up the question of the difference between.
That's because people take too much and they overdose. And
is that it's not it's not a qualitative difference. It's amount.
Well, what's happening today is that the rate of death from properly prescribed pain medication, which a lot of people in post-traumatic stress, they got wounds and injuries, are very much more powerful than the typical opioids that we used to have, okay? And people overdose some of them by accident.
Okay.
That's what's going on. And you look at the amount of people on chronic pain medication, they don't need that, okay? They don't need it for chronic pain. You can treat that. But they get addicted to it, and then there are more people dying from these legally prescribed opioids than they are from heroin overdose. Just kind of perspective. So within our own system, it's self-regulating. So if you supply the building blocks, your body will make what it needs, and you're not going to go into an overdose.
Okay, gotcha. Right.
That's the key. Self-regulation rather than external input. Okay, so basically when the opioids drop, you get this sense of urgency, and people really, it's good in an actual military emergency, but not so good for the rest of your, running your life. So the low opioid output causes an increase in dopamine output, and it's all complicated, but I kind of set it pretty straightforward. Okay?
Right.
That's what we're looking at. And then low serotonin is suppressed in the system, and so norepinephrine and GABA increase, which increases memory access, but also some anxiety. So the GABA reduces opioid availability. They compete. But it does increase dopamine output. It's a little confusing there. But basically what I said is what we do is people coming in, they have this weakness to begin with. It's stressed. They don't recover so well in terms of the ability to do dopamine, endorphins, enkephalins after they're out of the stress. So they stay reset at this lower level of neurotransmitter production. And the result is they're susceptible to all sorts of stresses.
Okay.
And on top of that, our general society stress level doubles every 10 years.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like that can go on indefinitely.
Well, hopefully not. But in addition, our inability to produce opioids can be partially explained by brain injury associated with weak germplasm for both parents. So, in addition, our inability to do the opioids is made worse with vaccinations, because remember that inflames the system, and poor diets at conception and gestation, and drug use and so forth. So we're looking at a total picture where we're compromising, which is exactly what we're seeing. Why 50% of post-traumatic stress syndrome is what we're seeing in today's wars versus 5% World War II. And Western Price's work in the 30s also kind of correlates with changes in facial and dental arch structure, but they indicate prenatal injury from a poor diet. So that's what we see in 97% of juvenile delinquents. It kind of all overlaps. So a prenatal injury, which could be all things, including getting vaccinated in utero, but poor nutrition, stress of the mother, environmental pollution, interferes with the genetic expression of our ability to produce opioids. That's the key concept.
Okay. And
our inability to produce it results in diminished ability to feel at peace, calm, with urgency. And it impedes our ability to normally recover from normal stress. In addition, alcoholics, the children of alcoholics have a lower plasma beta endorphin level, which is also connected to the 1/3 less endorphin level, so 1/3 less dopamine level. So it's all kind of coming in and showing up with our people who are high rate of post-traumatic stress disorder. The result is, if you're not producing opioids and we're having increasing environmental stress, there's going to be more addictive habits because people are going to look outside for the opioid production, such as the pain medication that's so rampant today, so they can get some sense of wellness. So when we look at it, here are things that are going to raise your dopamine in a D2A1 allele person who got post-traumatic stress disorder. Alcoholism is one of the big things that gives you a temporarily dopamine high. Exercise, eating, gambling, smoking, sex, drug addiction, and I'm going to say legal drug addiction, and then opiate-stimulating drugs such as marijuana and cocaine. So you have opiates, then you also have opiate-stimulating drugs like marijuana and cocaine. So all these are going on in the big picture.
So this is why any of these things, negative or positive, would have an addictive effect, right?
Yes. If I understand your question right, yes.
Okay.
So now we're going to go one step further in trying to kind of understand this story. So this is another way alcohol works, and it will help understand why people feel better when they do alcohol. So alcohol is metabolized to tetrahydroisoquinolines, TIQs. Okay, and these TIQs, tetrahydroisoquinolines, it's a long word, bind to one or more opiate receptor sites, and they give a little stimulation. But the bad news is they displace the enkephalins and endorphins from these sites. Enkephalins are a form of opioids, endorphins coming more from
So alcohol metabolizes into fake neurotransmitters, is what you're saying, right?
Correct. Yeah. Okay. Particularly for stimulating the endorphins.
Okay.
So the TIQs, because it's easier for me to say that than pronounce it, tetrahydroisoquinolines, act like opioids and induce a sense of well-being temporarily. Worse, they create a feedback system which decreases enkephalin synthesis. So suddenly we're not producing enough enkephalin, and therefore you kind of downgrade because you're getting that. So the result is they increase the level of enkephalinase in the system and further decrease our level of natural opioids. Research shows that, the natural opioid production, like the dopamine, is about 1/3 less than normal. So, Italian researcher Ganazzini found that the beta endorphin levels in the cerebral spinal fluid of chronic alcoholics was 65% less than the average. So you can see that this is very, very serious. Okay?
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's really a self-perpetuating cycle, because you get more aware that you need something the more you take this as the solution.
Yeah. So basically, there's a decrease in enkephalin production, which, as I say, is a natural opioid. Overall, the opioid production is increased by 1/3, and then in some cases is up to 2/3. It's pretty bad news. So I mentioned chronic stress can do this, because, as I say, the endorphin levels are reset at a lower level, and that's kind of what we're looking at in the big picture. When and it will help us get an insight into the post-traumatic stress disorder, why it's increasing in our society, because people in each generation are getting more and more nutritionally deficient, and therefore less able to produce and activate the normal pleasure center function. Okay. And it gets worse with the amount of time spent. So the rate of alcoholism, which is a sign of endorphin and enkephalin decrease, so alcohol increases according to how long you've been in combat.
Okay.
So do you see where it goes on? You can really begin to understand what's going on with our vets today. And this being Veteran Day, I think it's a good piece to consider. It's like, wow, we really can help people a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting that all of this goes together with meticulously keeping nutritional education out of the conventional system.
Yeah, although I want to honor the fact that a lot of that has to do with ignorance. A lot of it has to do with ignorance for the doctors.
Yeah.
But the pharmaceuticals know if you who pay for the medical school education, basically, we don't want to really get people healthy. So
no, they mostly have completely good motives, and so do the pharmacy people who are learning that. They all mostly all of them want to help people. I'm not saying that they're keeping it out of the system. I'm saying from way above them, it's being kept out.
That's right, because health is a competitor to the pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah, it would ruin the business.
So the study connects chronic stress, as I mentioned. The point is pretty clear what I'm talking about. Chronic stress lowers endorphin. So, a poor diet that doesn't supply sufficient opiate neurotransmitter precursors and cofactors decreases the amount of natural opioids. High alcohol decreases natural opioids. So basically, we got to go back to a healthy, live food, organic diet, which is, I think, key. And is what I'm going to encourage people to do. Not everybody's going to be ready to follow that. That's why what we're talking about is not exactly a threat to the system, because we're talking to maybe 5 or 10% of the population that really want to do something. Have the motivation to do something.
Mm-hmm.
But we are not threatening the pharmaceutical companies.
Not as long as it stays really, really small like that. But if they changed it in the school system and conditioned people to want to know the truth, that would be another issue.
That would be an issue. So far, they've assassinated 40 doctors. So they're coming up with direct competitive things for cancer, and so forth, that are really a threat to the system.
Right.
Yeah. So we're low key because this depends on some self-responsibility, and that's less and less a commodity in our society. It's a big deal. But at least we should know about these things. Okay? We should know about this. And then we can kind of go from there. But in reality, 5 or 10%.
Yeah, that's a high figure, I think.
Yeah, it probably is 5%. But that's amount. I just had a person, Native American. Everyone in his family had diabetes and died from it. So he healed from his diabetes in 3 weeks. Completely lost 48 pounds, which is our record for 3 weeks, and really, really got it. And he got what the belief system they've had about it, and it's like now he's going to pay out and say this is curable. But you know what? You've got to love yourself enough to want to heal yourself. So that's the key in the discussion.
I can imagine that his mind now and his thought processes must be revolutionarily clearer. I mean,
well, that's what he says. Yes, he actually said that.
Yeah,
and it's like, oh my goodness. And his wife is very grateful, and it's all simple. I have 100% success rate in curing Native Americans with diabetes, but they have to be wanting to do it.
Yeah.
So the people coming to me are Native Americans are more highly motivated. So we're dealing with these models. Possibly with the Native Americans, it's more possible. Only because they have more tribal, kind of, let's say, motivation to undo it. So I'm going to present a little bit of a model that I've developed. It's in my book, Conscious Eating, of the neurochemistry of peace and well-being. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So first, we have a synergy. We have a lot of serotonin in the hypothalamus. It involves several centers. I don't want to get too detailed. In the mesolimbic area, which is more the emotional area, serotonin stimulates an opioid called enkephalin, which I've been talking about. Dopamine also stimulates it. So enkephalin, which is a good opioid, when it's released in the hypothalamus, inhibits the GABA, and that actually sets up another positive thing. And when GABA is released, it allows the release of dopamine, the nucleocumin. So serotonin stimulates the enkephalin, then it blocks a little bit the GABA, which then, when GABA is blocked, then you have an increase in dopamine, which are your two things activating the pleasure centers. So the dopamine activates the dopaminergic receptors, and you get this sense of well-being in 2 levels. Now, GABA metabolism is a little bit complicated, and I'll explain it a little bit, but GABA also inhibits the release of norepinephrine in the memory area called the hippocampus, and so we get the sense of contentment and well-being. But GABA also is relaxing because it decreases norepinephrine. So you do get, when you inhibit that, so we now have 3 things: increased serotonin, increased dopamine, and decreased epinephrine. Okay, increased norepinephrine, which it kind of gives you a little bit of a high.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And when there are enough neurotransmitters and opioid neurotransmitters, then these pleasure centers are activated in a way that creates well-being. This is the driving force, okay? People want to feel good.
Right.
People don't quite understand the misery of people doing the drugs and alcohol. It's like they don't feel good. At least for a moment they feel better.
Yeah, right.
So, but there's better ways to do it than becoming a drug addict.
Yeah.
Or an alcoholic. So, when there's a deficiency in this complex system, and it is complex, people start having symptoms of urgency, anxiety, angst, discomfort, irritability. They can't cope with stress so well. This is kind of what we see out in the general public. Increased anger, aggressiveness, hyperactivity, low self-esteem. And I would tend to say that some of this is what we're seeing in the political spectrum. Even like the Democratic Party, we see the Bernie Sanders people kind of really threatening in Nevada, the Clinton people, and when the senator from Northern California, Barbara Boxer, was speaking, she actually said this. She felt physically threatened. Now, where is that coming from? Why are we seeing it? Are we just political fanatics? Are we manifesting in this generation, because these are more younger people, this anxiety and discomfort and irritability and we're really aggressiveness and anger? Is that not an accident? Because we're seeing it in college campuses. People don't let people speak if they disagree with them. And so,
right.
Freedom of speech only for me, but not for you, because I don't like what you're going to say. It's hurt my feelings. But where is this coming from? And it's a sociological phenomenon, it's a political phenomenon, but it's also a neurochemical problem.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I just want to interject one thing with where you're going here.
Yeah, go ahead.
And that's that. What if your belief system or your religion tells you to engage in violent behavior in order to gain spiritual merits? What is going to determine whether you're receptive to obeying that or saying, no, this is nonsense? Could it be biological?
Well, that's a hard one. You're talking about the Muslim thing, obviously.
Yeah, because they're just doing their job to follow the scripture and create violence. And I'm wondering if the nutritional balance in the body and the chemistry, theoretically, as a hypothetical situation were changed, would they still be receptive to following orders along that line?
It's a pretty intense political question. And in all due respect to the Muslim, I have to say, this is a religious doctrine, so I'm not going to say you're doing it because you have a neurochemical problem. That would be disrespectful.
What about changing it away from a religious question to a strictly, how would you call it? In 1930s Germany, and as it got later in that fascist regime, this was not a religion, but people were being ordered within the system to commit certain atrocities. Would the willingness to go along with those orders change according to the chemical balances in the body?
to a certain extent, but again, because I think the Germans have a pretty good nutrition, okay?
Okay.
To a certain extent, you're more susceptible to this. And I think it's more applicable today. World War II, yeah, there may be tendencies, but the truth is people were caught up in a psycho-spiritual political phenomena. And the truth is a lot of people did disagree. I'll tell you a study, you guys are more interested in medical students. 5,000 medical school students protested what Hitler was doing. The next day they were all found hanging from the lampposts throughout Berlin.
Probably not a total coincidence.
Well, that's my point. So the point I'm making is people were, I'm not excusing anything, but people were really put under immense amount of pressure. Yes, there's certain people that's going to fit into their anger, hate, and the satanic energies that Hitler was generating. Okay, fine. But there's a lot of people who's like, I don't really go for this, or how am I going to get around it without getting myself killed?
Yeah, that's really interesting about the protesters in Germany. I never heard that story before.
Yeah, there are a lot of people, in the Jewish world we call them righteous Christians, and it's like, this is just morally unacceptable. But you had the Catholic Church explicitly behind Hitler. All Hitler's leaders were Catholics, and the Pope supported him. So there are a lot of things, like this is a religious thing, this is do you see what I mean? It's an extension of anti-Semitism, which came out of the Catholic Church, which is very clear and which they've apologized for. It's not like I'm exaggerating here. They have apologized. So, obviously, you had to have something to have apologized for it. But I don't think those are nutritional things. I don't, in the due respect to the Muslim world, I believe they're simply following what the Quran's teaching them. Okay?
Okay.
And
yeah, I'm sorry for the diversion. It just made. I just thought, if we can cut down violence in the world nutritionally, I think that would be really valuable. That's all.
I think what we're seeing in the United States is more related to that because we are having more degenerational decline. In some of these countries, like the Arab countries, they haven't gotten as bad as it has in the United States. Although I have to say that diabetes and sugar are really big in the Arab world. They have pretty much the highest rate of diabetes in the world, okay? We may have 8% here. Saudi Arabia runs about 45%.
Wow, interesting.
Right?
Okay.
Bahrain is 45 to 55%. So they eat a lot of sugar.
Okay.
But I don't think it's fair to say that their actions are because of the nutrition. I don't think it's respectful or fair, in the big picture. I think it's because that's what their religion teaches, period.
Okay.
Anybody that reads it can see what's said, and people are following what's being said. And I don't want to pretend that's not the case. So, and I also want to say that what I'm talking about is more in America, probably more in Europe, but America leads the world in poor nutrition.
Okay.
It leads the world in the, I think we're 37th in overall health. Okay? Number one, twice as much money is spent than any other country in the world on health, but we're 37th. I think that's accurate. It varies, but I think. So that's what we're talking about. We have white flour, white sugar, junk food, GMOs. GMOs are not, labeling is required or they're not legal in 64 countries, and that's pretty much all the European countries, maybe with the exception of Ireland. I'm not sure, but I think you get what I'm saying here.
Yeah.
So what I'm describing, I think, would be more fair to say applies to the U.S., and the U.S. is the leading edge. It's going to happen all over the world. The U.S. is the leading edge, and that's what I would say at this point.
Yeah, our government's a tremendous supporter of GMOs, probably the strongest in the world.
Yeah, GMOs, white flour, white sugar, junk food.
Yeah.
Corporate. I mean, Europe doesn't want the junk food, doesn't want GMOs. They understand that. And Russia has made GMOs illegal.
Yeah, incredible.
The number one organic exporting country in the world. They understand these issues.
Right.
That's kind of what I'm saying here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so So the lack of pleasure centers stimulation is just too low. People just are driven towards addictive behavior that, overstimulate the dopamine receptors, raise the endorphins and enkephalins, drugs, sex, overeating, gambling, and so forth. So that's really what we're looking at, more obvious here in this country. We lead the world in drug abuse. We lead the world. I want to just make that point. It's like, what? This is why. Because we're the most deficient in our pleasure centers.
Okay.
And it's a little bit with ADHD and Tourette's. Significantly more of these kids develop drug and alcohol addictions because they have the D2A1 allele. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So children with severe ADHD had a higher percentage of alcoholism. Okay? And more so, higher percentage of ADHD relatives had a higher percentage of depression and alcohol. They're genetically connected. It's not a moral issue.
Right.
And 50 to 85% of those with Tourette's have ADHD. So there's a huge genetic overlap. So we can treat a lot of these by building up the neurotransmitters. So I'm speaking to, again, as we say, maybe 5% of parents and so forth. But one of the main brain neurotransmitters is serotonin, which is related to emotional balance, sense of well-being, and affects the limbic and prefrontal lobes, which are associated with concentration, thoughtful action, motivation. In other words, the areas that affect ADHD, besides the emotional balance, are going to be your prefrontal lobes. So what Dr. Cummings found was there was a significant decrease in serotonin and tryptophan levels, which are precursors to serotonin, in Tourette's syndrome and ADHD. So, we're seeing, these overlaps. So the overlap of low serotonin in these syndromes, and we don't know what that gene is, okay, but it's an undiscovered gene associated with serotonin production. But we know we can raise serotonin by giving tryptophan.
All right.
We also know, this is newer research, but basically the sugar depletes the neurotransmitters that prevent ADHD. So if kids are going to have lots of sugar, they're going to have an increased amount of ADHD symptoms because the little neurotransmitters they have are depleted with sugar. So if you go organic and cut out sugar, you're going to, this is an estimate, but you're going to, based on my clinical experience, probably get rid of 75% of that. ADHD is not a Ritalin deficiency disorder. It's excess sugar and pesticides, herbicides that disorganize the neurotransmitter systems. So this is an easy way to think about it. The solutions are very, very easy. So people with these syndromes, obviously we're talking about, are deficient in GABA as well, and D or D-L-phenylalanine, which are all tyrosine, which are precursors to dopamine and norepinephrine. So we need these things. Norepinephrine goes down, more ADHD. What's the message? Brain neurochemistry depends on a critical balance of neurotransmitters and opioid neurotransmitters, and that's what we're seeing with depression, anxiety, addictions, Tourette's syndrome, PD, post-traumatic stress disorder. That balance is disturbed. Later, in our next session, we will tip into how 90% successful approach to depression.
Mm-hmm.
Comes out of my book, Depression Free for Life. And it kind of puts it all together because the treatment for depression really covers all these things.
Okay. Yeah,
So,
very interesting that the more natural, holistic approach you get into, the number of different therapies you need for things gets smaller.
Right, because it's the same problem.
Right.
You have a neurotransmitter problem. Bring in the precursors and let the body do what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, okay.
So we have this working model, which includes a range of activities that we're seeing today: compulsive, obsessive compulsive activity, more compulsive activity, addictions, which are in a sense compulsions, repeated actions, food addiction, sex addiction, drug addiction, alcohol. So, wow, could food addiction that so many people suffer from really be a neurotransmitter problem? Absolutely, is what we're saying. We've got some other issues around with it, but that's one of the pieces. Depression in our society is rampant. And it doesn't get... The research clearly shows depression is, as I pointed out earlier in this series here, it's not really alleviated with SSRIs, except for a few people who are responding perhaps to the epinephrine or epinephrine kind of additions in there. Anxiety, ADHD, Tourette syndrome, post-traumatic stress disorder, psychosis, juvenile delinquency. They're all connected in, and they're all related to poor neurotransmitter, poor pleasure centers function. Okay? So my model that I'm sharing, okay, let's just make it a simple thing. Involves the expression of at least two sets of synergistic genes: serotonin production and receptor sites, and dopamine production receptor sites. There's a lot, okay? I mentioned GABA is a player and glutamine's a player, but let's just make it simple because it's an easier model to talk about, but it applies with all of them.
Okay.
So, it's simple. You've been hearing it. I'm just putting it together. Endorphins increase. They create a feeling of pleasure. They decrease cravings. And I'll say endorphins and enkephalins. They decrease cravings. They have a feeling. They enhance the feelings of love, joy, euphoria, and ecstasy. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Endorphins give relief from physical and psychological pain. That's the main pain thing. The dephenylalanine inhibits the activity in enkephalase. Okay, enkephalase breaks down endorphins. So okay, those are all things. Serotonin helps maintain emotional stability, self-confidence, sense of wellness, decreases alcohol and sweet cravings. Serotonin also goes down post-menopause, so it's very good to support women with serotonin precursors because that sense of wellness, emotional stability, self-confidence, a sense of discontent are all key symptoms. Serotonin deficiency increases depression, which is, again, an issue in post-menopause, but in suicidality, obsessions, anxieties, insomnia, sweet cravings, and irritability. These are all some symptoms with post-menopause, but they're really, everybody, when you're stressed enough, is going to get a serotonin deficiency. Sugar and marijuana and drugs like ecstasy and tobacco affect the neurotransmitter sites and undermine their function. Another key player is GABA. It creates calmness, relaxation, anti-anxiety. In some cases, it helps with insomnia. In fact, I use it a lot for insomnia. I use it, GABA and tryptophan really helps. A lot of people have insomnia. Norepinephrine gives energy. That's another neurotransmitter, and that gets decreased in kids eating sugar, so they have less concentration and motivation. So when you increase the norepinephrine neurotransmitter, it gives energy, motivation, ambition, power, alertness, feeling of well-being. These are things we see in ADHD, so sugar is a problem with that. Okay, and so lethargy, lack of energy, melancholy, depression, which we see in these kids, a lot of kids, is norepinephrine. We don't need to treat them with antipsychotics, okay, or anti-anxieties or antidepressants. We need to build their norepinephrine.
So a quick injected question in there. Sugar does all these bad things. What happens to your neurotransmitters when you eat an apple?
Well, if you're eating lots of it, fructose is going to depress your neurotransmitters.
Okay, so it's a question of how much.
But the amount of fructose in an apple is not like what you're getting in a teaspoon of white sugar.
Or a box of cookies or something like that.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
It's a relative thing.
All right.
Dopamine activates the pleasure centers. Okay, it creates feelings of love, contentment, ease, and inner peace. So we're looking dopamine, serotonin, somewhat like that. Dopamine deficiency, what is that called? Angst, depression, irritability, urgency. Urgency is more clearly dopamine. Lack of wellness. Okay. Now, we see those two things. When we take cocaine, speed, marijuana, alcohol, tobacco, and sugar, they interfere with the function of dopamine. They block it. You get some effect, but in the long run, they block it and degenerate the dopamine production.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
And L-phenylalanine increases the dopamine receptors. Okay, so as I mentioned, about a third of the people who have these problems are A1D2 allele deficient.
Is everything that you're saying that decreases dopamine production, can we assume that goes for serotonin as well?
Not really.
Okay.
I can't make that statement. I try to be more scientific. I got to talk about dopamine. There's an overlap, but it's not as well researched because a lot of research went into alcohol. And this is more about an alcohol understanding.
Okay.
So we have another 10 minutes, and I'm going to kind of bring out my whole model here, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And it's in my book, Conscious Eating, but basically, in the middle, I have a brain. And in the brain, I have depression, addictions, food, drugs, sex, gambling, violence. There's your violence, see, is the addiction. They have ADHD, learning disabilities, alcoholism, anxiety, obsessive-compulsive syndrome, Tourette's, post-traumatic stress syndrome. They're all like what's going on. Now, what contributes? So I have poor genetics, okay? Toxic exposure, heavy metals, pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, poor prenatal nutrition, poor in utero tradition. This is like there's a whole continuum. Emotional stress of the mother during pregnancy alters further alters the biological altered brain. Situational emotional stress, poor adulthood nutrition, poor infant and child nutrition. So they're all contributing to creating problems. Okay? So they're all acting on the genetics, lower dopamine levels, and lower serotonin and lower endorphin receptors. That's all going on. Your family history actually is important. Depression, alcoholism, ADHD, drug addiction, schizophrenia, manic depressive, severe anxiety are all have a genetic component. That's my point, what I'm saying, okay? We can't ignore that. If you come in, that's your history as a conscious parent, you really got to pay attention here. Then we add the toxic exposure in utero, poor prenatal nutrition, so the kid's not getting proper nutrients for the brain, heavy metals, and then obviously nutritionally deficient mothers and babies. They create at birth. You're coming out, your brain is already biologically altered. That's a tough way to start. Now it gets worse, right? So in childhood, you have more stresses, you have early drug use, again, heavy metal exposure, poor nutrition, you're not eating organic food, you're getting pesticides and herbicides, so it all adds up. Then the emotional stresses, because usually in these type of situations, the parents have similar problems, and so that everything is a lot of emotional stress on the kid. And then where does it take us? Take us into adulthood, which is the biologically altered brain in full expression, okay? Which is all the things we're talking about. Addictive brain, sex, drugs, alcohol, food, gambling, violence. And I'm going to really say the whole push into Satanism is that's another way of feeling pleasure because you get high off the satanic actions. So I don't want to, psycho-spiritually, that's a piece, of what's going on, because when you do these things, you get a temporary high.
Right.
Like child sacrifice and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So we have all these things, and that's the model that unfolds. Now, one other caveat, okay, the treatment is clear. Build up your neurotransmitters and all these drives and dysfunctional things and dysphoria, which means not being able to feel pleasure, anhedonia, not feeling pleasure, they go away. Okay? So I mentioned about the acute alcohol. That's an attempt, just like the legally prescribed opioids. There's an attempt to create at least a sense of false well-being.
Mm-hmm. Right.
The thing with the TIQs is they temporarily stimulate the dopamine centers and you feel better for a short time. However, in the long run, the system wears out and you move into chronic alcoholism where the TIQs don't work so well, and you're basically burning out your neurotransmitter production and receptor sites. And when you withdraw, you're missing, suddenly your false stimulators are taken away and you're kind of empty.
Uh-huh.
Okay, but you have to do that. And so there is that not feeling so good for a while. And what I try to do before I withdraw people is I actually start them on all the neurotransmitter precursors. Depending what they need, tyrosine, phenylalanine, tryptophan, glutamine, whatever they need, I'll start them on that. So before you go into withdrawal from some of these things, they already are producing some neurotransmitters.
Okay.
But in the end, recovery is you're producing your own, and better, you start to build your own. Like I mentioned, the L-phenylalanine, the L-phenylalanine, for example, is going to build postsynaptic dopamine receptor sites. So it's a nice thing. Is that you have to go through a little bit of difficulty before you get to feeling good.
Yeah.
So this is the thing. I want to just go over one slide. This is the center I mentioned in Minnesota. Okay. And
Okay.
basically, what they found, just to give you the percentages, because I couldn't remember what they all were. The people who don't have the nutritional support, their anxiety stayed at 100%, insomnia was 100%, tremors and shakiness was 100%, dizziness was 100%, depression was 100%, poor memory was 100%. But when they were on the program and had nutrition, it dropped from 100% to 11% with anxiety. For insomnia, it dropped to 6% from 100%, shakiness and tremors dropped to 2%, dizziness was 4%, depression dropped from 100% to 8%, 5%, and poor memory dropped from 100% to 11%. So we're talking very, very significant and powerful upgrading of your neurotransmitter production that makes you, like 75% successful after 4 years, which is more of a long-term thing.
And that's just with some supplements, without your full program of suggestions, right?
It's without the full program. It's just basic supplements, yeah. So that's really significant.
Wow.
So that is the model. The next session I'm going to talk about Depression Free for Life, which will conclude our very, very in-depth discussion of how to build a biologically active and functioning brain and how to avoid things that actually degenerate the brain, including psychopharmacological drugs that do create increasing degeneration. I'll just make the point I mentioned a few sessions ago. In 1850, as compared to now, it's 100 times higher totally mentally disabled people. And people were more sick in 1850, to get there, but there's 100 times more people who are now mentally disabled per population.
Right.
So that's what's going on in our society. We are having a serious degeneration. So may people be blessed with this understanding, and know that this can be reversed. And if you're really motivated enough to love yourself enough to heal yourself, then we got something. There's things that can be done.
Yeah. So really, you're holding out and explaining not just a general hope, but a specific prescription with variations to individuals, of course, that the ones that are motivated enough to see through the usual mental programs of how we're trained to think, that pretty much anything is possible. They can get to as good of or high of a state of well-being as they would like to do the work to get to.
Exactly. And that's the key thing, rather than, I've got post-traumatic stress syndrome, there's nothing I can do, just give you some drugs, and they become seriously debilitated.
Yeah, when you're told that you just
progressively so over time.
It gets worse, yeah. And that's, you said before, you can completely recover if not too much damage is already done, right?
Well, I don't want to put the if not. I haven't seen anyone who hasn't. It just takes some time.
So just about anybody can get better if and it just might take them varying amounts of time and effort depending on the condition that they're in when they start.
Yeah, a few months to a few years, Right. But you got, again, and you got to be willing to go on an organic. That's really big. Organic. I'm not going to say live food diet, because at live food, it really, for reasons which I can't explain, but what I've observed clinically, it significantly improves neurotransmitter production. I don't see that with the vegan diet to the same extent.
Yeah, I think really common is the person, when they do that for a significant amount of time, they feel like they used to be living in a fog and not really able to perceive things clearly at all.
Right.
So
there we are.
Yeah, wow.
It's a very optimistic viewpoint, but you have to know what you're dealing with. You have to know the mapping. And for that 5% of the population who wants to do that, it's there for you.
Yeah.
So that's who I'm really speaking to. I mean, in reality, that's who I'm really speaking to.
I think that's a great clarification, but I also think that if 5% change, it's going to have a ripple effect on the rest of everybody.
Oh, yeah. Over time. So that I think is good. I think that's the point. So yeah, but 5% do it. Maybe 15% are educated.
Right.
And then you have to go a step further in the picture.
Yeah, and what's even maybe more significant on one level is that some of that 5% may be in influential positions in the power structure. And then who knows what might happen.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you. And that's a lot for people to digest. I think it's incredible. This, in a relatively short time, I mean, we're getting an educational review here that is worth much more than most so-called higher education, where you just get more misled than you were when you started and in serious debt at the same time. So this is something to be appreciated, and I'm really grateful that you're willing to spend the time. So thank you, and we'll see what happens next time. We'll be back for our next installment.
Very good. Take care and blessings to everybody.
All right. Okay, so there goes our friend Dr. Gabriel Cousens, and as I was expecting, just amazing statistics, and I'm sure I may not have noticed it, but I kept saying, wow, amazing, and that kind of stuff. I don't know if you could hear it. I tried to not divert the discussion with that kind of deep comment, but probably did anyway. Before I say anything else, the video that I was trying to think of the name for, which was Dr. Cousens' production, showing how he demonstrated curing incurable diabetes in 30 days with juice fasting and related things that he did to help these people, is called Simply Raw: Reversing Diabetes in 30 Days. And I really recommend that you watch it. I watched it. I don't have diabetes. I already know not all about, but I know quite a bit about the raw food stuff. I've been on 100% raw food for many years. And it was amazing to me. I was just totally blown away and watched it more than once. So I recommend it to you. And so anyway, back to the discussion we just finished. The thing that jumps out at me from all of his amazing statistics that he started right from the beginning of our talk and went right through to the end is that, wait a minute, this is really obvious that drugs and vaccines are incredibly destructive. The medical industry has some really wonderful parts. It can put Doug and other people back together after they get hit by cars and trucks and things, and it's there's no question that it's saving lots of lives that way. But what they do with health and disease is the opposite. Even some of the things they do during the necessary reconstructive surgeries are very toxic, and there's better ways to do them, as some natural doctors have pointed out. But as far as the drugs and vaccines go, other than in absolute emergencies, well, the vaccines in no case, but the drugs in emergencies, they're incredibly destructive. So how is it that this very advanced, supposedly advanced paradigm of thought called modern science is doing this? What is going on? And everybody should be questioning that as soon as they run into it. But almost nobody is compared to the whole population. So what's going on? Physical and mental health, as Dr. Cousens was pointing out, are being devastated. Why does the system not realize that? And it just brought back to mind that this is not something. Well, historically speaking, I guess it's pretty new, but in the current, chapter of history, the system, the medical system that we have now, actually came in America around 1910, roughly around that period, because in 1910, which interestingly enough is about the same time they were setting up the foundation of what 3 years later would become the Federal Reserve and the IRS. I don't think that's any coincidence. They were some of the same people involved in that were thinking, gee, if we could have a system, these were really creative, technically brilliant people, and they were thinking, what if we could come up with a system of medicine, which was not a new term, it had been used, since Hippocrates and before. What if we could have a system of medicine where the medicine actually keeps you sick, makes you worse, helps you get even more sicknesses and more diseases, it helps your body degenerate as you age, in quotes, as you're in that body longer and longer. And then what if we had the medicines to give you for those new conditions? And what if those new medicines or drugs made you worse? And what if we had a monopoly on the entire system? That would be really good, right? Because that would be a spectacularly successful, huge business model. These people thought on big scale. And these are the people that ran the Rockefeller Foundation at that time and also the Carnegie Foundation, and they worked together quite a bit. And so they thought of a plan to do a survey of all the existing medical and healing colleges of the times around 1910. And in America, there was a wide spectrum of different kinds of medicine going on. There was homeopathy and naturopathy, and there were some, people that used drugs. Not too many because they didn't work, but there were some. And there were other approaches, and there was no... Actually, there were the beginning chiropractors, because that started at the end of the 1800s, if I remember right, in Iowa. And there were a bunch of these there were herbologists, and different physical kinds of practitioners, and massage and physical therapy people, and all different kinds of stuff. And the market, the free market, which was one of the elements of America in the beginning, would determine which ones became successful, because their customers and their patients would get better, right? It was kind of a logical way to run things. So they said, well, yeah, that's wonderful, but what if we do a study, the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations, And we'll do a survey of all the different approaches to health. And then we'll decide which ones are legitimate and which ones are what do you call it, quacks, right? And frauds. And we'll arrange funding, massive funding for the good ones that we say are good. And the other ones we'll let die and be outcompeted. And so they did, and it was called the Flexner Report, Flexner, you can look it up. And it started giving massive amounts of money to the ones that would be centered around drugs, and that was the cartel of companies that they would control. And they gradually started the program that now is completely controlling also the curricula, what is taught in the medical schools, and it's a complete monopoly on what you're allowed to do to try to be healthy. It was amazing, and it worked. These people are really successful business people. At least they have been so far. I mean, they'd be incredible if they ever did anything actually positive, which eventually, hopefully, will happen. So now they work together to protect the monopoly, and it's what you see operating all over. And the hidden but obvious purpose of the entire medical industry, and I don't mean the great people that work in it, because their purpose is to help people almost entirely. The ones I've met, the doctors, even if they think drugs are wonderful and they don't understand what's wrong with that, they're still mostly there wanting to help people. And I don't have any objection if they want to make a lot of money at it. I think that's great. Whatever you want to do that can really serve humanity, if you can make a lot of money to allow you to do even more and enjoy your life, I think that's great. Nothing evil about money at all. The bad part comes in when you start making money by intentionally causing harm. And mostly that's going on at the top levels where they do know what's going on. They do understand that the medical industry is designed to keep you sick, and it's designed to keep you addicted to as many medical drugs as possible, and indirectly to over-the-counter drugs, and often street drugs, because you feel so bad all the time that you don't want to be in that, and drugs offer the quickest way to apparently feel good. And Dr. Cousens talked a lot about that, because they create more dopamine and serotonin and the things that you're missing. So they get rid of the depression, which is mostly what the women are fighting, and the anxiety that makes antisocial violent behavior that a lot of the men are dealing with. And of course there's a crossover there. Some of the women are very antisocial, especially now. I mean, it's like they're trying to be as bad as the men. And the men, I've run into a lot of them that are very depressed. And they're almost all on these chemicals and drugs, unaware and weak. And it's perfect for tyrants who want to take over, because people aren't going to resist what they're doing. And it's very much like the defense industry, whose name was changed, I think, under the advice of Edward Bernays, right? Freud's nephew, who was a master of propaganda used by the U.S. government. And it used to be called the Department of War, because it was in case you had to have a war, which it was assumed would hopefully never happen. But under Bernays' advice and others, they changed it to the Department of Defense. So everybody would say, oh, defense, that's wonderful. So it could be starting wars all over the world, and it would still be defense, so it would be legitimate. And the goal of the defense industry is, of course, the perpetuation of war. So when you look at the deeper goal of each one of these major industrial complexes that Eisenhower warned about, Kennedy warned about right before he was killed, these people believed in conspiracies, absolutely. And they were trying to tell you without getting killed themselves, which didn't work in Kennedy's case, but Eisenhower was, and others were warning too, is that there are these massive conspiracies that are all part of a bigger conspiracy. I think Kennedy called it monolithic, which means all unified. One shape, in other words. And it's all upside down to what the propagandist tells you. So the medical industry is in charge of extermination. It's become the number one cause of death in America. You can look up, Death by Medicine. It's a free PDF by Dr. Gary Null and Dr. Carolyn Dean. Put it in any search engine, get the PDF, and it's free. And it makes it totally clear and documented that the number one, in spite of the wonderful people that are working in it and the lives that are saved in car accidents and all that, because of the focus on the drugs and the chemotherapy and all these horrendous therapies that they do, it's become the number one cause of death, about 1 million a year in America alone. And that's not all mistakes. It's a lot of the following the exact therapies that they're supposed to do. And likewise, the defense industry is in charge of trying to create world war, which they're getting closer and closer to every day. Not a mistake. It's their actual purpose. And the educational industry in America and elsewhere is in charge of making sure that you can't perceive what's going on, that you can't think, that you can't reason, that you think a discussion is quoting other people who are acceptable and unquestionably trustable, like the government agencies. That's what we're taught in PhD classes in health sciences. If you want to have a scientific discussion, you don't put in what you think. That would be unscientific, and you certainly can't do that. That would be crazy. What you do is, when you want to say something in the discussion, you cite or quote or paraphrase what an absolutely trustworthy source like CDC says, and that's what you say in the discussion. In other words, they're wiping out your ability to think. The central bank, which was created in 1913 in this country, and they've got central banks all over the world, and they're bombing countries that refuse to be controlled by them, like Libya and Iraq and other places like that. And then they put in the central bank under the Bank of International Settlements in I think it's Switzerland. So to bring everybody under a centralized control, like the One Ring. And the central bank is in charge of creating poverty, because if you create poverty in the whole society, then the theory is everybody's going to be so busy trying to survive or qualify for government welfare that they would never think of being dissidents or exposing what the government is really doing. So many other examples. Free trade, the purpose of the free trade agreements and treaties and everything is control, total control, destroying jobs and industry, wiping out local industry, and that's been done to America now, which is a signatory to many free trade agreements, and as a result, almost every industry in the U.S. is being totally destroyed. And then the government says, well, don't worry, we'll create jobs. No, they're not going to create jobs. Well, they create some jobs, like they'll hire you to spy on people or to be part of, the power structure. But real jobs that come from private businesses that are supposed to be all over the place, those get completely destroyed by so-called free trade. The biotech industry, which is presenting itself as advanced agriculture and, the way to make crops not fail in drought and all these wonderful humanitarian purposes. The purpose of the biotech industry is to wipe out farmers and the crops they grow, and to wipe out healthy food, and to create scarcity of real food, and eventually create complete non-existence of real food. Like they've almost already accomplished that with corn and soy and cotton for real clothing and stuff like that. They've almost destroyed those industries, those crops completely in the U.S. already. Did you realize that? Corn, a real basic crop like corn, is almost completely destroyed in America now. It's almost impossible to buy fresh corn that's actually corn anymore. You go into a store that's really into the poisonous food, like Whole Foods, for example, or any other store, I'm sure, the grocery stores, Safeway, and all the others, they'll sell fresh GMO corn, which has been shown in animal testing to cause complete sterility in 3 generations. In other words, the end of a species, and cancer and organ damage. And they'll put a big sign up on what a good deal it is and feed it to people on purpose. This is the biotech industry. It's organized crime. And they're fighting to just label the biotech poison in stores, whereas anybody in their right mind would know that this has to be banned from the whole planet instantly, and then eradicated off of the places that it's migrated to on the wind into the remote mountains of Mexico and everything, where it's already turning up in the wilderness, breeding by the pollen blowing in the dust with the wild corn that originated in tropical places like that. They should be doing a worldwide effort to clean up every last trace of anything GMO at all. But instead of that, they're just fighting to try to put a label on the poison so you'll know before you eat it that it's going to do something terrible to your body while you get, I don't know, 2 cents off compared to organic. Even if it's double to get organic, it's better to not eat than eat GMO. I mean, this is just my opinion, of course. You can disagree, but I would say that's common sense. So the energy industry, likewise, is in charge of hiding the sources of free and clean energy that have been available for at least many decades, probably way longer than that, actually. There are archaeological and other indications that in very ancient societies, they had very advanced sources of energy. Some of the Egyptian hieroglyphics show helicopters and other flying vehicles very clearly. But of course, you're not supposed to know about that, or about the find of Egyptian artifacts that turned up in Arizona, that they probably didn't go there walking across the Atlantic Ocean to get there, but now that's all cordoned off. And this is not a conspiracy theory. I live near it. And it's got military people with machine guns who will shoot you if you go in there to see what's going on. So the real condition in the world right now is interesting, and getting more interesting as time goes along. In the energy industry, people have actually tried to expose the more reasonable sources of energy, not just for electric generation with magnetic generators and things like that, but for fuel. And no, this isn't, I know if you're a troll, it's your job to say this is all totally stupid and use all kinds of profanity to say how crazy it is, but it's actually the truth. There's a guy named Stan Meyer and many others that have demonstrated, well, in Stan's case, that cars could be run on water. And no, it doesn't mean that you put your garden hose in the gas tank and drive your car, because there are serious problems in trying to do that. It doesn't work. But you can have this, what's called a hydrogen generator under the hood, because it's dangerous to carry around a large amount of hydrogen. It tends to create a bomb, and you don't really want to do that. So, however, hydrogen is 2/3 of the water molecule. There's 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 of oxygen in every molecule of water, and you can split them apart in the water with a tiny bit of electrical current. So people have actually successfully done this, and one of them, named Stan Meyer, was really good at it, and he put it in some kind of vehicle that I remember, like an El Camino truck or something like that, and he drove all over the country, just openly doing this, I guess not appreciating that this is forbidden. You can't do stuff like that. You have to join the rest of society and say, oh no, we need to bomb more countries to get cheaper gasoline, and, complete nonsense. I mean, we haven't needed oil-based energy for a long time, but not only that, there's plenty of oil. It's not like Michael Rupert's big book said that, what was it called? Peak oil, I think. It was really scholarly work. The only problem with it was that it wasn't true. And in 1973, on the north slope of Alaska, they found so much oil that it would have made it unnecessary to import any, even using the old stupid technologies of oil-based energy, for the next 200 years. And the day that they opened up those wells and hit the major oil sources, the government agents were there ordering them capped, the records sealed, and anybody who wanted to talk about it could, see their families exterminated. So they decided, okay, well, I guess we won't talk about it until much later. And what was the guy who wrote about it? Lindsay, maybe I'll remember his last name. I'm forgetting key things today. Sorry about that. But it was a man who worked there as a chaplain for the oil companies, and he later wrote a book called the oil, the energy non-crisis. That was it. Energy non-crisis. You'll see his name right away, Lindsay something. And he was writing that about how they had to seal up these wells because they weren't supposed to have plenty of oil. Because how could you justify bombing and reorganizing the whole Middle East if you did that? And I think probably even at that time, the idea was to put the extreme Orthodox Muslim rulers in charge whose goal, right in their own scriptures, is to take over all other countries and kill everybody who wouldn't convert to their religion. And how could you justify doing all that if you had plenty of domestic oil? So they sealed the records, they capped the wells, and that's what the energy, industry is actually doing. So we have an interesting situation to deal with in the world right now. And I don't see, most of the people who go so far as to expose it and explain it don't really talk much about solutions. And I didn't even get into the fact that we're being sprayed with all of these incredibly, not just the toxic metals, the aluminum, barium, strontium, but biological agents. And I just found another great video that's going to be on the new LostArtsRadio.com site about geoengineering in New Zealand and the incredibly complete complicity and conspiracy in all the government agencies and the academic institutions that are saying, nope, doesn't exist, nothing like that going on. In fact, the New Zealand agency that was responding to this one inquiry, kind of like the Freedom of Information Act request in the U.S., was saying, not only do we think there's nothing like that going on, but we see no evidence of it going on anywhere in the world. And basically, you're all crazy, so get back to watching TV and stop worrying about it while we kill you. This is a worldwide coordinated movement to shut down humanity and exterminate us. And the degree of complicity and cooperation, which is the definition of conspiracy, is mind-boggling. And that's why it's so important that you get taught that there's no such thing as conspiracies, only conspiracy theory. But when you get back to looking at the answers, I've looked at it for a long time, and I think that the only thing I can see is there's something stronger than what the negative power structure has, and each one of us is walking around with it hidden inside us. And so the reason for all this health stuff that we talk about, the natural, like what Rima Lebo calls natural solutions, or what any of us call a different approach to your lifestyle, upgrading it, getting rid of the processed foods, getting rid of don't eat anything non-organic, drink water out of plastic, filter the fluoride and the chlorine out of your water because they're both poisonous. There are certain things that everybody's deficient in that you should probably supplement in a good way, one of which is iodine. Great source on InfoWarsStore.com for one of the highest quality. But there are other ones. There's a real cheap one on Amazon that works okay too. And vitamin D3, which is, not the whole thing, but one of the main elements that you get in adequate sunlight that almost nobody is getting enough of. And when you don't get enough of it, all these other things happen in your body which are not good. You've got to do those things to stop the massive disease and suffering and so-called aging that is just torturing and killing humanity right now. But getting rid of the health problems is not the ultimate reason to do all that stuff. The reason is that once you get rid of this little detail of physical body issues, then you can start doing your real work. And that's where you can approach this point of action inside yourself that is way beyond belief systems. It's into the realm of experience, where you find out that what was behind the belief system could actually be true, and you can connect to it directly. And that can be used in a way that I think, and time will tell if this actually gets to be tested, I think that could not only shut down the attempt to exterminate humanity, but it could reverse it so that people within the power structure could become our allies. And I don't just mean the defectors that we're already getting. I mean, even some of the top people could theoretically redeem themselves with the rest of their lives being actually helpful and productive. And that, I'd love to see that. So one of the key elements is that instead of being intimidated by what's going on around us, we could take the opposite point of view and just tell everybody, share all the what do you call it, the forbidden information. You know, sometimes there's unpleasant consequences, like when Dr. Molden, that was talked about by Dr. Cousens today, said he was going to expose the drug industry, and they said, really, are you? And he had to be killed along with all the other holistic doctors. But, you know, we're not going to stay here permanently anyway, and if enough of us decide to do this, I think one of the main keys of potential success is not to see anybody as an enemy. And I know this sounds really crazy when you know the terrible things that are being done by the power structure. But if you change the frequency and the vibration in your own mind so that you reach out to people within the system as potential friends and allies, your power potential goes way, way up. Just like in Star Wars when Luke refused to fight with and kill Darth Vader, and then it turned out later Darth Vader was his father and saved the galaxy. And he probably wouldn't have saved the galaxy if Luke had killed him, right? So you have to defend yourself as much as necessary if it comes to that. But before that happens, we have a chance to try something more positive, and it has far more power. It may look peaceful, but it's incredibly powerful. So one of the things I've decided to do, because we can't expand this work and do what we want to do and build this educational center that's going to be really expensive. We can't do that without money, and I won't do anything on this show for money that will compromise the quality of energy here. So I decided to start making videos, and we're going to have a subscriber service where for $5 a month you can get access to all the videos. I'm going to make them every week, maybe every day, short ones, inside information. I'm going to expose everything I know, everything that I'm doing. You'll see me personally, which I really didn't want. I've had enough of surveillance, but I don't care at this point. I'm just going to expose everything that I can possibly expose. And if you join it and you help me spread it on social media, if we can get enough people, if we can get millions of people on this, we can generate the money quickly to build the educational center and actually demonstrate what we're talking about instead of being intimidated. And I think it can be done if we do it without an atmosphere of contention and enmity with the power structure and invite them to join us. I know that sounds crazy, but I think there's a hidden possibility of success there. So if you agree with me, please subscribe to the new service. You go to lostartsradio.com or lostartsresearchinstitute.org. They're both up and running, but the Lost Arts Radio one's being upgraded. And donate and set up a profile for $4.99 per month, starting right away. You can be one of the first ones. And you're going to have direct access into the private videos that I'm going to start making immediately. I did something really radical. I even got a smartphone, which I would never want to do otherwise, just so I can make these videos for you. I'm going to do them in a lot of interesting locations, and it's going to be incredible. So that's my, contribution along those lines. I hope that you enjoy it, and I hope that it really helps you in your life. I hope you'll sign up for it right away, because and at that price we need lots and lots of people, or it's going to take us 1,000 years to get the money to build the school, and I want to do it like right away. So some of you have big social media circles and followers, lots of followers. Tell everybody, get them all to sign up at lostartsradio.com. Donate button, $4.99 a month recurring, and you'll have direct access. Doug is going to arrange that so that you'll get right in, and then you can comment, you can leave me your feedback, and still come to the Saturday and Sunday shows. We can talk about it on the Saturday call-in show, 8 o'clock in the morning Pacific, 11 o'clock Eastern, blogtalkradio.com/lostartsradio. That's a call-in live show. It's really interesting, so join us on that. And then the Sunday night show, which we're on now, 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern, And that's where all the amazing guests will be, like Dr. Cousens and others. That's going to get more and more interesting as time goes on, and will remain free. So help us out, okay? Subscribe to the new $5 a month deal, and I'll see you on the private videos. And it's going to be amazing. So anyway, we covered just about all we wanted to. I hope that you got something out of it. And we will see you on the private video circle, and also next Saturday morning and for the call-in show. And have a great week. Hope everything goes great for you, and I'll see you then.
If you'd like to support Lost Arts Radio, one brand new way that you can do that is by becoming a monthly subscriber to our new video subscription service. Richard is committed to making daily or several times a week short educational videos that will only be available to you if you're a monthly subscriber. The subscription cost is just $4.99 per month, and it's paid via PayPal, so you can use your PayPal account or any major credit card. To sign up, simply go to lostartsradio.com and click the Video Subscribers button along the menu at the top of any page and sign up right there. We will then send you your own personal login, and you can then access these new videos as Richard adds them to our site. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/LostArtsRadio. Visit our website at lostartsradio.com for Richard's weekly focus articles, as well as lots of other really great free educational resources. We also have links to all of the great independent musicians whose music we feature each week on Lost Arts Radio.
To be the love in this world. I'm not one to open up right out of the gate. There's a reason why I need you to patiently wait. I retreat to solitude when approached by someone new. I'm hurting from a cold, dark past, but praying for a rescue. If you shouldn't take it slow, then maybe I can learn to let love grow. Like sunshine rising in the sky, you bring warmth of summertime. Your words are like a breeze, a soothing song that washes over me. I begin to believe as I hear you whispering that love is an amazing thing. You try to make me smile, to melt away my fear. You're cracking through the eyes of so many years. Your touch is light and true. Keep doing what you